Rony here. So the Dick Cheney funeral coverage just struck me as weird. Why was there so much glowing coverage of Dick Cheney? For many years, he was regarded as like the most evil man in the world. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it was the biggest gamble, the biggest discretionary optional gamble taken by any American president ever. ChatGPT tells me that's not a ridiculous assumption. And it was a disaster. It was absolutely unmitigated disaster. And Dick Cheney was a major player behind that decision to invade Iraq. And then why all the glowing coverage of him? Why was there so much emphasis given to his motives of public service, supposedly, right? Nobody knows what his motives were. The facts on the ground were that he was a terrible vice president. He was part of a terrible administration, an administration that just engaged in these unnecessary wars and occupations in Afghanistan and Iraq that by one measure from Brown University cost the United States $7 trillion. All right, by comparison, 10 years of Obamacare cost the United States $2 trillion. And now on top of that, John Mearsheimer, who was always opposed to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, let alone the occupation of Iraq, he says that the American role in precipitating the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then the conflict of essentially NATO versus Russia in Ukraine is 10 times the disaster of the Iraq invasion. So the Iraq invasion was a $7 trillion disaster. Mearsheimer says the Ukraine war is 10 times that. And so I really like this Donald Trump peace plan. I think it could possibly wind up this conflict. And the United States doesn't have any vital strategic interest in how much of Ukraine is occupied by Russia. What the United States has a vital strategic interest in is reducing tension with a nuclear power. Russia can cause us a lot of trouble all around the world. Russia and Europe are at loggerheads, and they can cause each other a great deal of damage. And so the prospect of reducing tensions and restoring a more effective and cooperative relationship with one of the world's three greatest militaries seems to me like a really good idea. And I hear Mark Halper and all these other experts saying, well, what about what Putin will do next? This doesn't punish Putin sufficiently. He's going to roll up Poland. He's going to roll up the Baltic states. He's going to invade France. Putin doesn't even have a military to take over all of Ukraine, let alone go into Poland or France or these other places. So I just consider much of that news coverage incredibly hyperbolic. So this is Hal Brands on the U.S.-China relationship.
China. But we are definitely at a moment of transition from a historically very benign environment, both for the United States and for multinational business during the post-Cold War era, towards something that is, as of yet, less defined, but is going to be less benign than the world that we knew. And so just to back up a little bit, if you think about the 25 to 30 years after the end of the Cold War in 1989, let's say, that system was defined by a total imbalance of power in favor of the United States. It was defined by the dominance and spread of democratic values farther than they had ever spread before. It was defined by an increasing globalization, not just of trade, but also of finance and production, which was what really differentiated the post-Cold War globalization from earlier globalizations. And it was an era when we assumed that the world was moving in the direction of convergence, that you were going to end up with sort of one international system that was led by the United States, where countries would move towards freer markets and freer political systems. And international conflict, it would always be a feature of international life, but it would gradually subside.
The end of history.
That's right. Yeah. And I think Fukuyama put it very well in that essay that he offered back in 1989. And what distinguishes the current era is that all of those features of the old era are in flux. They're all being contested at once. We don't live in an era where the world is as unbalanced in favor of the United States as it once was. We're seeing democratic values under strain, even under siege in countries around the world. We're seeing a resurgence of forms of state capitalism, where we're seeing globalization fracture. And it's not entirely clear what this is all leading to, but we're in this moment of transition, and moments of transition are typically pretty unstable. And so regardless of what happens in
So we're always living in a moment of transition, what academics would call liminal space. Another term that academics love to use, and this is Professor Hal Brands, an international relations expert, they love to use the term contested and contingent. And they're right. These are highly useful terms because so many things that may appear fated are highly dependent on the unique qualities of a particular situation.
the Red Sea tomorrow or in Ukraine next month, we're just going to have to get used to a higher baseline of instability and risk.
So in thinking about how we've gotten to the new, if not normal, where we are, I wonder whether American unpredictability is the cause of the new instability or a product of it. You know, you wrote in the new piece, the quote, "The uber uncertainty of our moment is that American power is enduring, but American purpose is elusive." And 6 years ago, which now feels like forever ago, I did a big slide deck entitled Deglobal, suggesting that establishment failures, think forever wars, great financial crash, rising inequality, ignored climate change, hyper-partisan divisions fueled by unchecked social media, that led both to a loss of American self-confidence and to a loss in confidence in the American system. But what I wonder, and you write so well about, is whether I underappreciated the degree to which the crinks, the revisionist powers, were rising on their own, offering both an alternative model and undermining ours.
I think it's complicated. I guess what I would say is that I am not of the school that believes that the United States is in decline absolutely or even really relatively. I mean, if you think about basic indicators of American power.
So one way that I've tried to distinguish myself from the mainstream media is that I don't feel a moral obligation to just say positive things about people after they die. You say, oh, that makes you a jerk and all that. But when you're a public figure like Dick Cheney and just the disasters that he played pivotal roles in, it just seems to me obscene to focus on his glowing motives and on his public service attitude and his wonderful personal qualities.
Percentage of global GDP, for instance. The U.S. has about the same percentage of global GDP today that it's had since the early 19.
Well, it's significantly risen in the last 5 years. It's not just that it's approximately the same. America's share of the global economy has gone up over the last 5 years and looks to be jumping significantly in the years ahead. But back to public figures, when they are so destructive, like a Dick Cheney, right? It just strikes me as positively obscene to focus on his wonderful personal qualities. The disaster of the 2001 and 2003 invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, that he had a certain type of sense of humor, just seems completely of no importance compared to what he did publicly. And so public figures being evaluated by the mainstream media should be evaluated primarily on the consequence of their actions in public, and the consequences of Dick Cheney's actions were terrible. And so why on earth was the mainstream media so glowing about Dick Cheney when they were so rightly critical of him, not critical enough during the years of George W. Bush's presidency? So one, establishment institutions protect their own. Right? Dick Cheney was the insider's insider. He was part of the old GOP foreign policy priesthood. He was what a serious statesman is considered in the blob, in our national security industrial complex. So when someone like that dies, Washington closes ranks. The obituaries write themselves. People interviewed are former colleagues, other people in the blob. They share the same worldview. And they're not eager to reopen the Iraq wounds because that puts their own judgment on trial. The news media was terrible in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. They were incredibly credulous of all these dubious reports about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. We've never had a full reckoning for the disastrous invasion of Iraq. And so we're just getting these euphemisms, these polite euphemisms. The invasion's called controversial and complex, right? A realistic appraisal of Dick Cheney would force the media to admit how many of their own were complicit in the disaster of the 2003 invasion. Another thing that led to the mainstream media's glowing coverage of Dick Cheney is that he served as a foil for Trump. Dick Cheney hated Donald Trump. Dick Cheney's daughter hated Donald Trump. The media hates Donald Trump. So when Cheney was in office, he got heavy criticism. But when Donald Trump arrived, the entire frame changed. Now Cheney was revered. He was part of the old guard. He represented hierarchy and competence and discipline and respect for institutions. And the media praised him as a symbol of the pre-Trump Republican Party. Right? So the current eulogy is not really about Dick Cheney. They're about what he's not. He's not an outsider like Donald Trump. They're a way to elevate the old establishment consensus against the populist right. It's a shot at Trump. Look at what Republicans used to have. We disagreed with them, but at least they were serious. Elite nostalgia. So Dick Cheney was part of an era when the national security elites were much less questioned. They were much more respected. Intelligence chiefs, defense secretaries, Pentagon advisors dominated conversation. Trump shattered that ecosystem. And then there are all these norms around funerals that we should just speak with a soft, reverential tone of the dead. I don't buy this. And it's interesting to compare and contrast the coverage given to Dick Cheney's death with the coverage given to Charlie Kirk's, right? Charlie Kirk's coverage was less hostile than it would have been in 2024, but overall far more hostile given to Charlie Kirk, hostile coverage given to Kirk rather than given to Dick Cheney, because Cheney was an insider, and Charlie Kirk, he didn't graduate from college. He was an outsider, right? And so Dick Cheney's sins, his errors, his gigantic mistakes were just reframed as public burdens, right? Tragic national misjudgments rather than personal depravities. All of Kirk's sins were framed as personal depravities: aggressive rhetoric, conspiratorial thinking, provocation as a business model, racist, sexist, right? And the Trump factor shaped both reactions. Charlie Kirk was close to Donald Trump, so trashing Kirk is a way of trashing Trump. So Dick Cheney is eulogized as a flawed giant who represents the old order, right? Charlie Kirk was described as a disruptive polemicist who represents this new frightening populist movement that's possibly fascist. Dick Cheney's obits soften moral judgment to preserve institutional memory. Charlie Kirk's obits sharpen moral judgment, right? The media suddenly becomes very morally judgmental about Charlie Kirk, but not judgmental about Dick Cheney, who was responsible for the deaths of unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. So it's curious what the mainstream media decides to get all morally judgmental about, right? It's not Dick Cheney and hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. It's that Charlie Kirk said some nasty words, right? So Dick Cheney had a legacy framed as geopolitics. Charlie Kirk had a legacy framed as culture war combat. Dick Cheney essentially belonged to the club. He belonged to the cool kids. He belonged to the institutions. And so the club, the cool kids, the institutions mourned him. Charlie Kirk was not in that club. So the coverage is colder, more conditional, more defined by the system's need to place him at arm's length. And why does this hit me? Because I experienced so much of this. I was profiled many times by the mainstream media, and there's always a coldness, a disdain, a contempt, and there was a dropping of the normal rules of journalistic coverage when it came to me. So Jewish Journal used about 6 devastating blind quotes just filled with contempt for me in a way that the Jewish Journal would never use for anyone else, but they'll use it for me because I was a blogger. I was an outsider. And so the mainstream media doesn't just report, it signals. It tells you who counts as legitimate and who's outside the realm of legitimacy. And podcasters and bloggers are outside the realm of legitimacy, that there's no institution behind them. I'm not subject to their gatekeeping, right? The MSM hostility to me and to other bloggers wasn't personal, it was structural. I represent a world that they cannot domesticate. I operate much of the time out where the buses don't run no more, right? The MSN likes its distance trained and housebroken. A Noam Chomsky, right? He is acceptable because he's inside academia. Ta-Nehisi Coates, he's acceptable because he writes for elite magazines, right? A lone vlogger, it's harder to categorize. There's no institution behind someone like me. And so Charlie Kirk also lived outside of the institutions. Journalism is a guild, and they protect their guild members with warmth, and outsiders Anyone who threatens their monopoly on information gets footnotes, caveats, framing words like provocative, polarizing, internet personality, right? All sorts of boundary markers to say this is not someone who is socially acceptable. So people on the outside, such as myself, we earn attention through risk, through operating out where the buses don't run no more. We operate without a safety net, through raw output, not through institutional titles. And so the MSN, they're quite suspicious of this. They don't know how to talk about it without acknowledging how their own monopoly on the selling of information has collapsed. Right, so I am sensitive to these choices in tone and in phrasing and how they communicate a hierarchy. So Dick Cheney dies and the warmth signals say this man was part of our world. Charlie Kirk dies and the temperature becomes ice cold because he was not part of their world.
1970s. That was when the U.S., whose share of global production had been dramatically inflated by World War II because everybody else was blown up, sort of settles in the 20 to 25% range. And that's basically where the United States is, at least at nominal rates today. And if you look at key indicators of power in other respects, if you look at sort of the primacy of American tech firms, if you look at America's global power projection capabilities, the United States is still in a class of its own in many respects. I think that the major challenge is that it's not entirely clear what the United States wants to use that power for these days. And I think here is where the point that you raised in your prompt is particularly acute. There are a lot of ways in which the uncertainty about the uses of American power is actually the blowback from the post-Cold War era.
So when does the mainstream media praise somebody's presumably good motives and when do they not? Well, they tend to extend this generosity to insiders, right? Has nothing to do with evidence, has everything to do with social signal, social position, institutional affinity, and what's useful for the narrative. So Dick Cheney was part of the governing class. The MSM reflects is to frame his bad choices as tragic, right? Not as moral failures, right? He believed he was keeping America safe. He was driven by public duty because it's not so much protecting Dick Cheney as protecting the institutions where he was dominant. If Dick Cheney had bad motives, that implies the system itself went off the rails. Mainstream media prefers a softer story where good intentions led to bad outcomes. Outsiders, right, get the presumed pathology, right? When you're not part of their network, you're not part of their institutional world, right? They don't feel responsible for you. They regard you with suspicion and you're not treated with good faith. And so when the news media uses devastating blind quotes about an outsider, it's a signal this person is not under our protection. Anyone can take a swing at him. There's no need to hedge. Motives are a social judgment. They're not an evidentiary one. All right? There's no way for journalists to know Dick Cheney's motives. What they knew is the norms of their world, that people like Cheney are spoken about in the language of statecraft. They're morally serious. They make weighty decisions. When you have an outsider, a Charlie Kirk or myself, the instinct is the opposite. All right, our motives are treated as suspect because we operate outside the structures that they trust. So they assume bad motives, ambition, provocation, ego, grift. Motives get granted when it helps stabilize the narratives. So Dick Cheney's good motives stabilize and soften the story of the Iraq disaster. It lets the news media avoid confronting how many of them supported the war or gave it oxygen. Right? If you don't give Dick Cheney the benefit of granting, oh, he had good motives, then the whole Iraq invasion disaster horror story rises to the fore, and that's quite awkward. So when someone's given good motives, it means they're part of the cultural tribe, right? They get the motive presumption. The MSM is generous for someone within the tribe, someone outside the tribe, the motive presumption collapses.
So I happen to think that globalization was good for the world. I think it was mostly good for the United States, but it also produced economic insecurity in the United States, and it produced cultural and political insecurity as well. And that has been playing itself out really for almost 20 years now. And that fuels both uncertainty about American purpose, but it also fuels broader global instability because it creates uncertainty about whether the United States is still committed to the promotion of an open world economy or relatively open world economy, whether the United States is still committed to the alliances that have maintained the peace in places like Western Europe and East Asia for generations. And so the U.S. Attitude of the moment is in some ways a product of the global forces of the post-Cold War era, but it's also a cause of the global instability that we see today.
And looking at the chat, why was Rachel Maddow of MSN Now at Dick Cheney's funeral? Chat says, Poland is a dagger pointed at the heart of Russia. It used to be a dagger pointed at the heart of Germany. Yes, different nations have different interests. Control of the narrative is more important to the mainstream media and maintaining their political theology than war and death based on a lie. Key feature of power is the ability to control the narrative. So what determines the power of a narrative? It is popularity of the narrative, how well it meets the physiological needs of the people invested in the narrative, and how powerful are the people promoting the narrative. So sometimes narratives will win past the gatekeepers, such as with the Epstein story. The populist fervor around getting to the bottom of the Jeffrey Epstein fervor overwhelmed the gatekeepers. Chat says that Richard Spencer's latest podcast way too long. They don't provide enough punch. He just goes on, and his nuggets of insight are rare. Mossa, meaning Jewish moral discussion, has no place for charisma. So one way of understanding the difference between Christianity and Judaism is that in the traditional Jewish perspective, the age of prophecy ended about 2,200 years ago when God would speak directly with man. And in the Christian perspective, God entered the world 2,000 years ago through the person of Jesus. Louis XVI of France lost control of the narrative, and that was the end of him and his regime. Same with Tsar Nicholas II.
All right, so we build this as a discussion. We build the discussion as a look at U.S.-China relations 2026 and beyond. So let's dive into that. You wrote, and again, I hate to rotate on the recent piece, but it's so good. The quote, the Sino-American ceasefire that Trump and Xi negotiated last month is doomed. Temporary truces are possible because neither side is ready for an all-out decoupling, but China's preparing for that eventuality. Yikes.
So I'm not much interested in the Jeffrey Epstein story. It doesn't really grab me. But I did read a little bit about the release of all these emails, and then one thing jumped out at me from the 10 years that I spent blogging about the porn industry. And my takeaway from interviewing hundreds of people in the porn industry, whether porn stars, porn directors, porn producers, porn distributors, porn directors, is that there was one quality that seemed virtually universal in the industry, and that was the people in it lacked ties. They lacked bonds. They lacked concrete connection to family, to community, to a church. And it was this rootlessness that allowed them to engage in the porn industry. When there are other people who are important to you, you can't help but take them into consideration. But when other people aren't important to you, then you just can do anything, which can have many wonderful opportunities will come up, but also you can just dive right into unbelievable levels of depravity, because the normal things that hold people back from doing things that are shameful don't hold you back when you're a porn star. And so I'm reading these stories about these Jeffrey Epstein emails, and I was struck about all the similarities between porn stars and our rootless elite, right? They both depend upon moving through the world with very little friction and being incredibly mobile. And so I have an essay here in the New York Times talking about the elites as revealed in these Epstein emails. Their loyalty is less to concrete people, nations, communities than horizontal to fellow members of their borderless network. So when I grew up as Seventh-day Adventist, when you live in a high-intensity religion, your primary loyalty is to other people in your high-intensity religion. For Orthodox Jews, usually their primary loyalties are to fellow Orthodox Jews. If you have a high-intensity racial identity, then your primary loyalties will be to people who share your intense racial identity. If you have an intense sporting allegiance, then your loyalties may very well go to those people who share your sporting allegiance. And for people who are heavily invested in their work, if your work is your life, then in all likelihood, your primary loyalty will be to other people in your profession. If you're a neurosurgeon, if you're an attorney, if you're an accountant, if you're a journalist, if you're an author, meaning you do these things for your living, you are primarily invested in your profession, then your primary loyalty will be to members of your profession. And so you see that with the elites, right? Their primary loyalty is to other people in their profession. So when I go back to Australia, I'm reminded, wow, this is a great place for an average bloke. But the most ambitious Australians tend to move to the United States. They tend to move to California or New York. And they do it because they want to primarily mix with the people who are at the top of their particular profession, be it law or medicine or the academy. And so Jeffrey Epstein moved in a world of elites, and their primary interest and their primary concern was with each other. And he thrived in this barter economy of non-public information, right? This is the strength of Jeffrey Epstein. He seemed to know a lot. And if you have met people who know a lot of things that are not in the news, that are not accessible, for me, it's absolutely intoxicating carrying on these conversations. They add depth, they add complexity, they add layers, they help things that don't make sense just based on what's publicly available. So I understand the pull that his non-public information had for his fellow elites. And there are different status games at work. I'm engaged in a status game right now. I want to get status for adding clarity and providing superior commentary to my competitors about what's going on in the world. Smart people need money, and rich people want to seem smart. And so Epstein was good with money, and he would use his money to attract connections with smart people. And so they were each seeking to trade, right? You had money being traded into prestige, prestige traded into fun, fun into intelligence, intelligence into money. So for many rich people, it's really important to them to seem as smart as possible, right? Seeming smart is a guarantor of open doors. And if you're an alien on landing on Earth, and the first thing you see are the Jeffrey Epstein emails, you'll gauge the status by the spelling, grammar, and punctuation. And the usage is inversely related to power in this network. So the earnest scientists and the scholars type neatly. The wealthy and the powerful reply tersely with misspellings, erratic spacing, stray commas. Right? So all people are on the same team, the elite team. Right? They may support different political policies, but you have a group in these emails whose highest commitment is to their own permanence in the elite class. And when their principles conflict with staying in the network, right, the network wins. So on the one hand, porn stars and rootless elites look like people on the opposite side of the social spectrum, right? One group is on the bottom of the status hierarchy, the other sits at the top, but they share this deep structural trait, right? They detach from normal, stable ties. So weak ties free you from shame. Shame is social, right? It only works if you feel accountable to a particular community.
Why are things doomed? Why is there not a win-win or an even a acceptable non-doomed future out there?
I think the trade deal or the quasi-trade deal that Xi and Trump seem to have reached in South Korea last month, and I say seem to because a lot of the details have yet to be worked out, is really best viewed as a band-aid on a steadily deteriorating relationship. And if you think about the U.S.-China...
So in the liberal worldview, discussion and words mean a great deal. But in a non-liberal, more realistic and traditional worldview, words, discussions, and treaties can't cover up fundamental conflicts of interest. And so for Neville Chamberlain, he kind of epitomized the liberal worldview when he waved a piece of paper and says, this will mean peace in our time. And if you rely on the Constitution, if you rely on agreements signed on paper to guarantee your safety, it's a naive perspective. You're giving more power to words and to agreements than they really possess. The United States and China have powerful conflicts of interest, and all the paper in the world won't dissolve those conflicts of interest.
Relationship. There are deep structural drivers of tension. and that relationship. There is a deep clash over who is going to lead the international economy and technological innovation in the 21st century.
So in porn, what's distinguishing is that they didn't feel much accountability to their family, to their community, to their church, and they were able to do porn because they weren't closely bonded, they weren't connected, nobody was monitoring them. And so this lack of social connection freed them from the internal voice that says, I can't do this to my parents, my family, my siblings, my community. And these rootless elites, as portrayed in the Epstein emails, seem very similar, right? They live in a world of mobility and insulation rather than trauma, right? They can always fly to Zurich tomorrow. Your real community is a global class of fellow nomads. And so local shame loses its sting, and shame is always local. I remember flying back to Australia and experiencing, in the space of arriving in Australia in a few hours, in a day, that 90% of what was of concern to me in LA just disappeared. Right? I was a different person walking around in Sydney than I was in Los Angeles. So the more mobile you are, right, the more you live in a social world where ordinary consequences don't seem to stick. Right? Porn performers operate in a stigma economy. They've crossed outside of normal society. They are outside of the world of the polite, so you double down. You drift into a peer network that normal people cannot enter, will not enter. And so this new porn family becomes your only family, similar if you're a heroin addict. And elites do the same, but in reverse, right? Their network absorbs the fallout. You get caught in a scandal, you go quiet for a year, then you resurface at Davos. You get embroiled with Epstein, but you find connection elsewhere among fellow elites. So internal loyalty to the tribe allows both porn stars and these globetrotting elites to shrug off external consequences. Both rely on horizontal solidarity instead of rooted loyalties. So porn people survive because they live in a world of a porn family. Agents, performers, directors, fans, right? They build their own micro-society where people share this marginalization and this mutual need for each other. Elites operate in a borderless network. Goes from New York to LA to Davos to Aspen to Dubai. And their loyalty is sideways to their peers, not downward to their fellow citizens or upward to any transcendent moral authority. So in both worlds, you're identified by people like me more than by your family or your place. Both flourish in anonymous, liquid cities like Los Angeles. Right? People in Los Angeles feel much less rooted than people on the East Coast. Ties of religion, ethnicity, school mean much less in LA than they do on the East Coast. A porn industry needs anonymity, right? You can just disappear into the churn of a city with millions of strangers. And elites use cities in the same way. They move from New York, LA, London. They go to airports, conferences, hotel lobbies, right? They have a geography-free existence. Where are you today? Can we meet before you go wheels up? So cities allow both groups to behave without the drag of national, communal, inherited expectations. Both porners and elites depend on constant motion. Right? They survive by being perpetually available to do scenes, conventions, collaborations, travel, shoots. Right? They are constantly in circulation. Elites treat mobility as proof of their importance. I just landed. I'm boarding soon. I'm in transit to Dubai. So when you're in motion, you don't have to sit still long enough to face the consequences of what you did. Both worlds encourage moral compartmentalization, right? In porn, you split your life into your porn performer on-camera actions and then your off-camera life. And you ignore the long-term effects of what you do. You stay focused on your immediate need for money, validation, adrenaline. For elites, you split your life into public virtue and private indulgence, right? You move from Obama's West Wing to Goldman Sachs to Epstein's list without blinking. You feel very little obligation to ordinary people, and then it becomes easy to rationalize anything. Both groups treat relationships as transactional. Porn is built on short-term collaborations. Intimacy is faked and forgotten. Elite networks operate the same way. Connections are edge. Edge is tradable. What can I get from you today? Who can you introduce me to? Without this edge, right, the relationship decays. So rootlessness is the soil in which terrible choices grow. The best moral guide is to think, how would I feel if my words, my actions were accurately portrayed on the front page of the New York Times? Right? People fear disappointing those that they value. But when you're constantly moving, you don't have the same level of ties. That's why traditionally strangers are regarded as suspect. People who move around a lot are regarded as suspect because such people don't operate with the normal moral consequences that face people who have roots and bonds. Right? The world becomes a playground when nothing roots you. So these two groups, not comparable in power, but they're highly comparable in the structure of their lives, right? Both live outside the normal guardrails because they lack what most people depend on: thick ties, grounded expectations, a sense that their choices reflect back on people that they love. So rootlessness makes anything thinkable, which leads to moral drift and vulnerability. Porn stars break themselves. Elites, when they make bad choices, can break society.
Century. There is a deep clash over whether the U.S.-led alliance and security system in the Western Pacific is going to endure, or whether China will be able to enforce its writ on that region and turn it into its own sphere of influence. There is a deep ideological tension over whether American-style democracy and representative government or a less liberal form of Chinese state-led capitalism is going to be the way.
The Epstein emails also give us insight into the rise of people like Donald Trump, right? The elites diminish their own credibility and capital in part through idiotic things they said during COVID with ordinary Americans. And so ordinary Americans saw that the people running America weren't looking out for them and the institutions weren't on their side. And populism needed only one spark. And there was a spark that the powerful live in their own world with their own rules. And so Donald Trump said, hey, I am your retribution. Right? Populism thrives on betrayal. And ordinary people have increasingly felt betrayed by our institutions. And Donald Trump said, hey, they're not thinking about you, right? And he provided a narrative, he provided an insight that resonated with enough people to get himself elected, right? He could portray himself as the man who disrupted the Epstein class. All right. Populism depends on increasing cohesion of society. Elite rule depends upon a fractured pluralistic society. And so MAGA and populism are about increasing social trust and social cohesion so that we no longer are a country divided up, pluralistic, and dominated by our elites. So the emails, the Epstein emails reveal the status games among elites, right? Mobility, insider information, mutual absolution, getting an edge, getting access. I will add money to your smarts, or I will add brains to your money, right? So that you can signal how important you are. Information is the currency that elites trade. Indifference to outside opinion is the glue that holds them together. And so the election of Donald Trump was in large part a revolt against the rule of the elites as portrayed in the Epstein emails.
Of the future in the decades ahead. All of these questions predated Xi and Trump. All of them will outlast Xi and Trump. And if you just look at Chinese policy, I think there are very few illusions about any of this. I think Xi Jinping is utterly realistic in understanding that the United States is China's greatest rival and the greatest obstacle to China achieving its ambition of becoming the biggest, baddest, most powerful country in the world. I also think that China is preparing, as you mentioned, for an eventuality in which there will be much more significant decoupling between the United States and China. If you look at what China has been trying to do under Made in China 2025, under the Dual Circulation Initiative, it is all about creating greater resilience against pressure from the outside world. And if you look at the sort of things that China is stockpiling today, fuel, food, other commodities, it's preparation for a crisis that can emerge either as a result of a war or as a pretty rapid, surprising decoupling between the US and China. And so Xi and Trump can negotiate these ceasefires that temporarily slow down that process. And they both have.
So Donald Trump got in a lot of trouble for talking about how Ukraine started the war with Russia. And technically, Russia did invade Ukraine. It wasn't the other way around. But Ukraine made choices. The United States made choices. The West made choices where it created strong incentives for Russia to invade Ukraine. So Ukraine did not launch the war, but Ukraine and the West made choices that precipitated the war. And while the Iraq War cost Americans perhaps $7 trillion and thousands of deaths and injuries, right, it didn't change the balance of power between the great states. It didn't push Russia and China together. It didn't accelerate a new global order. It was a bad war, but a contained one. Now, this war is different. It directly pushes the United States into a long-term confrontation with a nuclear peer. It pushes Russia towards China. It drains Western stockpiles. It fractures relationships across the world. Right? It forces Europe into a strategic position it cannot sustain without the United States. And the disaster of incentivizing conflict between Russia, America, Europe is just unfathomable, the dangers that we're being pushed towards. And so anything that will bring an end to this war will be incredibly valuable for the United States. So I'm a big fan of the philosopher Rony Guldmann. I like his books, but he's just written an essay revisiting a ridiculous book by Jonah Goldberg from 2008 called Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Change. And unfortunately, in this new book, Rony begins with the Republican Party's headlong descent into fascism. So I can't take Jonah Goldberg's book seriously, Liberal Fascism. Can't take Rony Guldmann's essay seriously about Republicans descending headlong into fascism. Now, when I am inclined to try to engage with extreme claims, such as Republicans are becoming fascists, one way I do it is to look for ways that the statement is true and ways that it is not. But in this case, it is absolutely impossible to think of ways that fascism is the best historic parallel to MAGA. Right? Fascism is only one analogy among many. It's not the most precise one. It's not the best one. There's no world in which fascism is the sole or even the primary historical parallel for MAGA. Right? You can list entire families of political movements that map onto MAGA more tightly than fascism. There's Caesarism, right? You have a lone leader claiming to speak for the people. He dismisses the power of intermediary institutions. He treats legal constraints as petty obstacles. So you can describe MAGA as a version of Caesarism. You can describe MAGA as another example of American populism, as being something like the movement of Huey Long or Father Coughlin or George Wallace or Andrew Jackson. You've got an anointed strongman. He's got aggressive anti-elite rhetoric. You've got a strong sense of victimhood. You have a veneration of the ordinary people. So you have many American historical analogies to the MAGA movement. America doesn't have any substantial fascist tradition. You can look to South America and Peronism, where you've got a charismatic leader fused with a massive sense of grievance, erratic economic policy, resentment against elites, a cult of personality, right? So Peronism looks like MAGA. You've got Latin American strongman populism, charismatic leaders, media theatrics, loyalty networks, attacks on the courts, press, and the opposition, no consistent ideology, right? So you can look at MAGA as personalist populist, right? That fits far more neatly than fascist. You can look at Berlusconism. So Silvio Berlusconi used media spectacle, scandal, grievance politics, legal brinksmanship to rule in Italy. He was corrupt, he was nationalist, he was chaotic, but he was far from totalitarian. You've got all sorts of forms of tribalized democracy, of strongman populism, cults of personality, ethnic majoritarianism, reactionary restoration movements. Right? The only way that you can insist on fascism as the best analogy for MAGA is if you're using fascism rhetorically rather than analytically.
Have an incentive to do so because neither side is ready for this. China is not ready to be technologically self-sufficient. The United States is not ready to have resilient rare earth supply chains. But we're moving, I think, in a fairly pronounced direction. And so the trend of the next few years is going to be overall a downturn in the relationship. But it's not going to be steady like this. It's going to go like this, right? Because you will see temporary truces, and then there will emerge a crisis that pushes things in a downward direction. And so we should expect U.S.-China relations to be.
So Rony Guldmann is echoing dozens of essays in the mainstream media saying that MAGA reveals the latent fascist authoritarian impulses lurking inside American conservatism. And that MAGA is the logical fascist outcome of conservative politics. And MAGA exposes these deep psychological continuities between conservatism incorporated and fascism. Right? I find it a ridiculous argument. So rather than look for ideological essences, right, look to coalitional drift. Instead of looking at psychological destiny in political movements, right, just look at coalition incentives, reshuffling membership, moral vocabulary. So that's why I like alliance theory. Politics is primarily a matter of assembling a sufficiently broad coalition so that you can have power. And political belief systems tend to be patchworks of justifications that we create to serve our alliances and to fight our rivals. Political systems are not usually morally, philosophically coherent. They're not driven by deep philosophical commitments to principles like liberty or equality. Politics is driven by group loyalty and strategic communication to enhance the building of an alliance that can seize power. So MAGA is what you would expect when you have a shifting alliance that sees a way to take power. So instead of looking at what MAGA says as hypocrisy or self-deception, simply what happens whenever any large alliance is under pressure. The psychological engine at work underneath MAGA is not longing for fascism. It's just the ordinary machinery of coalition maintenance, where you're biased in favor of your allies, you have a negative view on your enemies, and the same mechanisms operate on the left. This is the state of the political in a polarized society. So don't treat coalition behavior as some kind of ideological essence. So Rony Guldmann is arguing that conservatism once maintained a thin liberal democratic superego and that Donald Trump liberated the conservative id. But the conservatism he describes was never unified by liberal democratic restraint. It was unified by the nature of its particular coalitional structure, just as my behavior will substantially reflect the situation that I find myself in and that I behave differently in different situations. So when Republicans were held together by anti-abortion, wealthy business interests, white Southerners, Christian traditionalists, anti-communist hawks, suburban professionals, then you had a rhetoric of limited government and the glories of the Constitution. The MAGA coalition is a different Republican coalition, and so the vocabulary shifts. Right? It's not necessary to look for deep psychological meaning in that transformation. It's just a coalitional realignment. It's not a moral revelation. And you see this in all democracies. When coalition members change, the ideological language changes. So there's no need for claims about the collapse of the conservative psyche. Right. Liberals and conservatives, Democrats and both Republicans, all show the same patterns of motivated reasoning once you map their alliances and their rivalries. Conservatives downplay harms committed by the military when the military is an ally. Liberals downplay harms committed by groups aligned with their side. Conservatives say people are too easily offended, but then they'll amplify grievances of their own allied groups. Liberals do the same with their allies. Conservatives insist on external attributions for the failure of working class whites while demanding internal attributions for the failures of African Americans. Liberals mirror the same pattern in reverse, right? These are not fingerprints of fascism, right? These are alliance fingerprints. These are the human default, right? These things arise whenever rival coalitions are in conflict, right? This is not the latent fascism hiding inside the Republican Party. This is all the predictable output of coalitional reasoning rather than ideological philosophical drift.
Be worse a decade or 5 years from now than they are today, even though the progress toward that outcome may not be linear.
So let's go all the way to the brink, and we can step back next. You write a long-term decline in the relationship punctuated by periodic crises, like you just said, even a war. How does such a war start? How would it proceed? How would it end? Who would win?
Well, candidly, it's hard to imagine anybody winning in a U.S.-China war, simply because regardless of who prevailed in the traditional sense, the damage to both countries, their interests, and the global economy could be quite severe, even cataclysmic. In terms of how it could start, I was just...
So up until about 1932, the Republican Party dominated our institutions, and then with the rise of the Democrats and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you had Democrats assuming more and more power in our institutions. So rather than looking at MAGA as proof that Republicans always long to be fascist, right, just understand when status rivalries and coalition composition shift, right, you get a change in rhetoric. So the rural white underclass realigned from the Democratic Party to Republicans. Evangelical Christians aligned more tightly with Republicans. Business elites split. The more highly educated people shifted to the Democratic Party. Knowledge workers migrated to the Democrats. So groups choose alliances based on similarity, transitivity, meaning the relationship as a group moves through different relationships, right, it changes its form, and interdependence. All right, it's not about doctrinal fidelity. So the alliance structure that elected Donald Trump in 2 out of 3 presidential elections is a different alliance structure from the Ronald Reagan era. And once you shift this alliance structure, you shift the moral language. So MAGA's style, MAGA's excess, MAGA's aesthetics are not evidence of a deep longing for fascism. They're evident of a new alliance structure. So Rony Guldmann reads the grievance as evidence of fascism in Republicans. But whenever you have a more intense in-group identity, whenever you have a rise of nationalism, you always have a rise of victimhood. Grievance is a universal tactic, right? Every side constructs narratives of victimhood to mobilize their own kind and to justify the behaviors of their own kind. One evolutionary psychology argument is that we have such big brains so that we can morally justify the horrible things that we do. We do the things that we want to do, and then we look to justify them. And when you have a sense of grievance, the easier it is to justify anything that you do. So the most interesting question is not why conservatives have become aggrieved. The question is what alliance structure makes which grievances strategically useful. And so Rony Guldmann argues that conservatism has revealed its fascist core because it's abandoned its principles, right? And he speaks as though there were a coherent ideological conservatism that MAGA betrayed. And you hear the same thing from the Bulwark crew and Jonah Goldberg, right? Alliance theory notes there never was such coherence, right? There are only coalitions that create narratives. The Reagan coalition created one narrative. The MAGA coalition creates another narrative. Neither narrative reflects an essential soul of conservatism. They reflect who their allies were, what conflicts they faced, and which tactical communications maximized support. So Rony Guldmann treats ideology as agent and alliance as effect, right? The alliance theory reverses that causal order, right? So conservatism and MAGA have not revealed a hidden fascist essence. You simply have a coalitional transformation with a change in moral vocabulary. And to win an election, you need a broad coalition. Then once you have power, a broad coalition makes governing more difficult, so you start shedding members of that winning coalition. So in his scholarly book, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, right, Rony Guldmann offered this structural analysis of conservative rhetoric and its tendency to invert liberal moral prestige and to recast conservatives as culturally oppressed. Now, in his new essay, Liberal Fascism Revisited, right, he evaluates these arguments in light of MAGA, and he concludes that conservatives are the real fascists. So the book had a straightforward thesis. Conservatism operates through a particular grievance narrative because conservatives are not in power. And to resist the domination of the left, they engage in political and intellectual judo. They like to flip liberal categories against liberalism itself. So conservatives attempt to level the playing field by appropriating the moral charge of fascism and redirecting it towards their opponent. All right, this is just a ridiculous argument, but it felt good for many Americans at a particular time and place. Oh, liberals are the real fascists. Now, this new essay, Liberal Fascism Revisited, is not detached, it's not analytical, it's not an evaluation, right? It is a work of polemics and name-calling. So it is a shift. This is Rony Guldmann no longer observing the cultural war from the outside. He's now participating in it. Now, what's amusing to me is the overestimation that Rony exhibited for Jonah Goldberg's book in the first place, right? Jonah Goldberg's book, Liberal Fascism, was ridiculous from day one. And yet, Ronnie Guldmann, in his book, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, he treats Jonah Goldberg's argument as if it were a psychologically revealing text that required a slow, even-handed excavation. Right? He had this respectful, analytic posture, providing the impression that Jonah Goldberg's polemic contained philosophical depth and conceptual rigor, which it had neither. Right? Trying to give depth and rigor to a ridiculous book like Liberal Fascism was a mistake from day one.
Just in Taiwan last week for a series of meetings with Taiwanese government officials and analysts, and there will be a long Bloomberg column coming to a newsstand near you shortly about this. That is the most likely place for a U.S.-China war to start, because that's where China's military prospects, its advantages, are greatest, simply due to.
The important point about Jonah Goldberg's 2008 book, Liberal Fascism, is not that it's wrong, right? It's just was never a serious work. Jonah Goldberg's not a serious thinker. It's ridiculous. Jonah Goldberg is a showy, light, superficial thinker akin to Bill Beckley. So to ever have taken Jonah Goldberg's book, Liberal Fascism, seriously is ridiculous. The book doesn't age well, but it was ridiculous from day one. So in his Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, Jonah treats this book as some kind of intellectual exercise worth decoding. Right? The book was never intended to withstand scrutiny. Its purpose was agitprop. It was a cultural countermyth. Right? Jonah Goldberg never deserved the interpretive charity that Ronnie Guldmann dished out. Now, the New Yorker just came out with an essay, Does MAGA Have Ideas? And it claims no ideas. It's just thin and just a bunch of reactions. But that's what politics is, right? It is not primarily philosophical. It's not primarily ideological. It's primarily about assembling a broad enough coalition so that you can seize power. So the idea that conservatism once had this stable, deep intellectual soul and then degenerated under Donald Trump is wishful. You had a conservative consensus that survived during a time that it had a certain coalition. When the coalition was stable, the ideology was stable. Now that the conservative coalition has changed, the ideas have changed. Right? Moral language survives only as long as the coalition served by the moral language survive in power. When a coalition reorganizes, its moral language changes. Right? When a movement becomes a personality cult, then the vocabulary follows the leader. Trumpism is not an ideological failure. It is a coalitional transformation that won 2 out of 3 American presidential elections. Right? MAGA has ideas. As with other political movements, it treats ideas primarily as weapons rather than deep philosophical commitments. Right? MAGA has more slogans than doctrines. It's more about identity than argument. It's about assertions more than principles. It's more about outrage than persuasion. Right? This is not fascism. It is simply coalition politics in its rawest form.
Geography. Taiwan at its closest point is probably 80 or 90 miles from the mainland. China has dozens of major military bases within a few hundred miles of Taiwan. And it's not simply an issue of geopolitical dispute between the US and China. It's an issue of national pride or national humiliation, depending on how you want to frame it, for China and for Xi Jinping personally. And so there are a lot of different scenarios you can spin out, but the one that worries me is a situation where China believes that its military advantages in the Taiwan Strait are growing and have put it in a stronger position. But it's also worried that Taiwan is sort of slipping away from it politically or diplomatically. And we can talk in greater detail what that looks like, but it's sort of the trajectory that we are on right now. And in that sort of scenario, I think Xi Jinping will be more tempted to use a higher level of coercion or force to try to bring Taiwan back into China's grasp. Maybe that looks like an all-out invasion. Maybe it looks like a Coast Guard quarantine or a naval blockade. But once you get into those situations, there's a lot of escalatory potential. And the challenge is there's not a clear theory on either side about how the war ends. And so even if the United States, for instance, were to defeat a Chinese invasion attempt or a Chinese blockade, there's nothing to say that China wouldn't reload and try again. And it would have the ability to do so because it has an industrial capacity, particularly a shipbuilding capacity, that's many times greater than America's, and would allow it to reload, so to speak, quicker in a crisis than the United States could. And so if a Taiwan war happens, it's not going to be over in 3 weeks. It's going to last 3 years. It's going to sprawl up and down the Western Pacific. It's going to pull in U.S. allies and partners like Japan and probably the Philippines and probably South Korea. Think of this as a big regional war with global economic ramifications, because it's also going to tear up some of the world's most sensitive technological supply chains and trade routes. So once you're in it, there are no good options. And so my hope for U.S. policy has long been that we will work really hard to try to deny China a pretext for starting the war, while also working really hard to try to deter Xi Jinping from ever thinking that the use of force is a good idea.
About 3 hours ago, Mark Halperin sent out a newsletter email that the Ukraine deal was as clear as an almond smoothie with extra whey protein powder. So Halperin talks about how confusing it is. Is the plan a U.S. plan, a Russian plan? Well, it's a Russian plan and a U.S. plan, and it's being presented to Ukraine with the emphasis that Ukraine really needs to simply accept this. So is Thanksgiving a deadline or not? Are the Americans and the Russians open to revisions? Right, what changes are Kyiv and Europe demanding? Right, not clear. So we have all sorts of European and Ukrainian envoys conferring in Geneva today, had a talks with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I think this is the most viable plan that we've had yet. So Marco Rubio, Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, he's in Geneva with the U.S. Army Secretary, who would likely be a major player under a J.D. Vance regime, and then negotiating with the Ukrainians on a document that would halt the fighting and give Russia fairly large concessions, such as control of Ukrainian territory that the Russian military does not yet control, would bar Ukraine from future membership in NATO, which is absolutely necessary for any kind of peace, right? Russia cannot abide NATO being up to its border, because while people in the West think of NATO as a purely defensive alliance, that's not how it's seen in Russia, right? Nobody is at ease with their biggest geostrategic rivals set up on their doorstep. And you see this with what happened on October 7, 2023, when Hamas poured in over 5,000 fighters into Israel. They did enormous damage. They killed hundreds of Israelis. And initially, my reaction for a long time was, how could Israel have been caught with its pants down? Then I realized that no nation can afford to keep sufficient forces on its border to stop this kind of attack. What stops this kind of attack is the realization of how severe the retaliation will be. But just having an enemy on your border is going to freak you out. And so it just makes sense to me that Ukraine must give up membership in NATO. And while Ukraine is not literally a member of NATO right now, it's been effectively a member of NATO for approximately 10 years, 15 years. So security guarantees, yeah, I don't think that America wants to become vulnerable giving security guarantees to Ukraine. And on Republican problems coming up on the midterms next year, really boils down to the economy. And it isn't clear that Trump has a clear plan for inflation and for growth. Dealing with both in the short term is tough, right? Dealing with both without staggering the nation into stagflation seems very difficult. So the Trump administration is bigging bet on the transformative power of AI, but my personal experience mirrors the American attitude. That is, that it seems like 80% of people have a somewhat hostile, intensely hostile reaction to AI. And the Trump administration is all in on AI and trying to stop any state regulation of AI. And the chances of Trump being able to fix the affordability crisis, or anyone being able to fix the affordability crisis, is moderate to minimal, right? All sorts of issues are outside of the control of politicians.
So, man, I want to go in a whole bunch of directions. Let me start with, I loved your book, Danger Zone. The premise of Danger Zone was that China, maybe like Japan in the 1940s or Germany in the 19 teens, was potentially peaking. A minute ago, you seemed to suggest that one risk is that they perceive that their relative capacity to capture it keeps going up, but that politically they're not going to be able to pull a Hong Kong and bully their way to get it back. The danger zone concept was perhaps that Taiwan figured out they've got to go Ukraine, and so that maybe Xi is going to realize we could probably do this in 2027 or 28, but by 29 it's going to be too much of a porcupine. Has your sense of the greater risk changed, or is it still the North Pole and the South Pole and it's all about living between them?
So I think that let me explain the danger zone concept a little bit more fully, just to put a little bit more flesh on the bones, so to speak. So my concern about
here are my favorite books on China, and particularly the conflict over Taiwan. Danger Zone: The Coming Conflict with China by Michael Beckley and Hal Brands. Michael Beckley, a few years ago, wrote another great book called Unrivaled: Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower. He built off a 2016 essay, but I think this is a key book to read. Unrivaled: Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower. And then there was another great book written on Taiwan by a major figure at the Pentagon. Let me find his name.
The Taiwan danger zone resides at the intersection of two or three different trends. One is Chinese economic stagnation, and that stagnation continues. China hasn't gotten back to anywhere near its pre-COVID growth rates since 2022. There are deep structural problems in the Chinese economy that Xi Jinping seems unable to fix or uninterested in fixing. And so if you remember, even 8 or 9 years ago, we used to have these conversations about, what year will it be when China finally overtakes the United States economically? Will it be 2035 or 2028 or 2024? The answer I think you would most commonly get now is never. It's not going to happen. And in many ways, the economic gap between the United States and China is getting bigger rather than smaller. And so if you are
a book that came out this year by a Financial Times correspondent, was incredibly compelling, called Apple in China: The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. It made the point that China's technological rise would have been impossible to the degree that it's done it without Apple, and that Apple's rise would have been impossible without China. That Apple has essentially trained close to 30 million Chinese workers. So Patrick McGee, name of the book, Apple in China: The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. Killer book.
Xi Jinping, and you thought that the world and Taiwan were going to sort of fall into your arms as China became the world's biggest economic power, you got to recalculate. At the same time, the military balance has been shifting in some dangerous ways. And so from now really through the end of this decade, maybe a year or two on the other side of that, China's military prospects will be improving in the Taiwan Strait, because China's military modernization, its buildup, got started years, even decades ago, and the fruits of that are really being reaped right now. It's less certain on the other side of that, because the U.S. and the
Elbridge Colby, right? He serves at the U.S. Department of Defense. He's the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and he published a great book, I think, in 2022 called The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. He made the point that unless Taiwan is willing to devote more resources to defending itself, the United States should not be all in on defending Taiwan. That the United States should demand that Taiwan step up and defend itself. It is pathetic how few resources Taiwan is devoting to defending itself.
A number of its allies in the Western Pacific now have some of the technological programs underway, some of the defense spending increases underway that can make Taiwan a much tougher nut to crack by the time you get out to 2032 or 2035. And so the danger is that Xi Jinping, when he looks at that confluence of factors, says, okay, I may not be able to get Taiwan back peacefully. My military prospects for getting it back may not look great in 2035, and plus I'll be in my 80s at that point. But they look okay in the late 2020s. And so maybe that's the time to take a risk. And that was the formula, I think, that led to Germany behaving the way it did before World War One. And so I continue to be pretty worried about for the 5 years running out to the end of.
Yes, if Germany had invaded France 5 years earlier, it would have won. 10 years earlier, it would have won. Germany's military, industrial, technological supremacy over its rivals was declining heading into World War I. Germany saw a narrowing window where it could deal with its enemies. So Germany was surrounded by enemies leading up to World War I. Had Russia, had France, it had England, all aligned against it. And if Germany had acted decisively 10 years earlier or even 5 years earlier, it would have won the war that it ended up losing. So there's been a great deal of media coverage of Tucker Carlson's interview with Nick Fuentes and how the right has this major anti-Semitism problem. And I think this is hyperbolic, right? The number of public anti-Semites or people who just hate Jews in the MAGA coalition is relatively small because it essentially marks you as nothing to lose. If you've got something to lose, you're not going to publicly come out with your hatred for any group, including Jews. So those who side with Nick Fuentes are overwhelmingly a tiny portion of MAGA. Nick Fuentes isn't MAGA. He's opposed to Donald Trump and MAGA much of the time. So I think the panic about Nick Fuentes outstrips his real reach, right? He has a small, intense constituency. I'm not even sure that Nick Fuentes is still rising. I think he reached his period of peak between, say, 2019 and 2022. He doesn't have the numbers that he had back then, right? His crowd is overwhelmingly marginalized losers, right? Small, intense, online, chaotic, young men without careers, without anything to lose, without institutions, families, or obligations that would discipline their speech, right? Because they've got nothing to lose, it's a lot easier to enjoy edgelord politics, right? That's their identity, but it limits their growth. So movements built on marginalized losers tend to burn hot and then collapse. Right? People who shape public policy, people who win political races want nothing to do with Nick Fuentes. The anti-Semitic fringe is loud because conflict sells. But if you look at the people who write checks, who staff campaigns, who pass laws, who run political machinery, it's not Nick Fuentes people. Right? They're not even in the room. They're not a faction with any institutional leverage. So the problem for Republicans is not numbers, it's optics, right? It's easy for Republican enemies to play up the Nick Fuentes types and to say that the right is just infested with these marginalized losers and haters. But if someone's got something to lose, they're not going to side publicly with Nick Fuentes, right? Anyone with anything to lose sees Nick Fuentes as career poison, status poison, poison for income. But it is an exciting story. All right, let's bring Kip back onto the show. What's going on, Kip?
Hey, man. I think Fuentes is interesting because I think the Etch-a-Sketch is getting ready to all kind of get shaken up. You know what I'm saying? So his ideas are going to be thrown into the void. And I don't know. I notice you keep throwing him in that same bucket as Richard Spencer. And I'm not going to say I don't mind listening to Richard Spencer because I do. He's a little bit more cerebral. But I think Richard Spencer gets 2,000 views in a week, and Fuentes probably gets, I don't know, 500 times that. You know, so he's a lot bigger audience, and he's the complete package. Where Richard Spencer, you kind of got to be a nerdy dude to be into him. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, Richard is educated. He speaks to an audience probably with an average IQ of around 115. Nick Fuentes speaks to an audience of gamers probably with an average IQ of 100, so it's a lot easier to have a bigger crowd. So there are some things that Nick and Richard have in common, and then there are many things that differentiate them. So Nick is primarily a gamer, and he operates in that genre of saying things for shock value. Nick isn't primarily an ideas merchant. Richard sees himself as playing in the more traditional game of institutions and the academy and the elites. So he speaks and operates very differently. And it's amusing that Richard ended up with failure and humiliation while Nick has cruised from strength to strength.
It probably helps me that I don't know Richard's lore because there's some cocksucking in there, isn't there?
I have no idea.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. He carries himself as a straight, smart, bookish man, but if I'm
How
not
straight?
mistaken,
I mean, Nick Fuentes doesn't carry himself like a normal straight guy either.
I mean, to me, I see Fuentes in the same vein as I saw. You remember Paula Poundstone, comedian Paula Poundstone, back in used to
Vaguely.
wear. Okay,
Yeah.
she used to identify herself as an asexual. And my mom did the same thing. She basically said that after being with my old man, they must not have been doing it right because she didn't have fun anymore. So she considers herself an asexual. So when I think of Nick Fuentes, is there a chance he's harboring some homosexual lust that's incongruent with his religious programming? Maybe, maybe. Or is he just asexual and got other things on his mind? I would probably be more inclined to that. But I've seen a couple of scenes before with him wearing cat ears, and I don't know. I guess I would just try to chalk that up to youthful silliness. Who knows? He's not our age, so we can't really hold him to the same standards as we hold ourselves. But
But almost
go
every
ahead.
right-wing talker is incredibly flamboyant and campy, as opposed to the major left-wing talkers. It's kind of curious why right-wing pundits are so flamboyant.
I've tried to explain this to you from a Jungian standpoint. Those queers have developed their contrasexual components. Okay, so they're more developed than you and I are. And I don't know if that manifests itself in IQ or EQ or whatever Q, but they are. It's not a hard fact, 10 out of 10, but you see it. I mean, I'm sure you see it, and you saw it through history that they have an openness for things that a lot of hardcore farting and spitting guys like you and me might not have. Uh,
Yeah,
it
different
make,
groups have different gifts.
yeah, 10-4, bro. I was wanting to in last week's show, I forgot to mention to you that Halpern, I guess, I think he was talking about Fuentes and maybe others as being followers of Hitler. The man's been dead for 80 years. What can you tell me what Halpern probably means? I know you're not Mark Halpern, but you're a Jew. He's a Jew. What does he mean? What does he mean? Follower of Hitler. What the fuck does that
Hitler
mean?
and the Nazis are the one transcendent in a world of secular moral relativity, and so
We grew up on the damn Hitler. We grew up on the History Channel.
Let me finish my point. So, in a world of moral relativity, the Nazis and Hitler have become the one transcendent, right? This example of ultimate evil that is then simultaneously both castigated but becomes weirdly fascinating. Most men enjoy watching documentaries about the Nazis. So Nick is operating in a genre where you shock people, and so Nick says very little about Hitler. Right? Nick, to describe Nick Fuentes as a Hitler apologist or a Hitler follower is just absurd. He has occasionally said something provocative about Hitler or Stalin, but it's just operating within a particular genre of being a gamer, where you just say things to shock people and to amuse people, to poke and demean the pieties that dominate our public culture. And so to attribute to Nick, he's this big Hitler guy, is just wrong, but it is the most attention grabbing thing that you can say, because in a world where in a secular world where everything is morally relative, that's the one moral absolute. That's the one way to try to cancel someone or to place a veto on anything that they say. It's like, oh, they're obviously outside the pale. Pass.
So basically, a follower of Hitler, he might be sort of accusing, Halpern might be a sort of accusing him of celebrating the accolades. I mean, think about it, Luke. We were raised on the History Channel, which might as well have been called the Hitler Channel. We know he had a smoking hot babe named Ava Braun, did he not? Right?
Mm-hmm.
His fucking dog, his dog loved him, right? Time magazine called him the man of the year in 1938. A fucking Jew, the most hardcore piece of shit Jew, could appreciate the fact that he rose from homeless vet to the fucking Fuhrer. I mean, that's something, right? The German economic miracle was celebrated by many long after he was gone. So what the fuck is a Halpern talking about other than just trying to get some cheap? You see how that's a little Jew trick there? That's trying to get, they know the Christian thinks in binaries. You see what they're trying to do? Let's shade him with Hitler, because we spend all this time talking about the bad things of Hitler without giving the full perspective. Dirty Jew trick in my book, which kind of needs me.
There's nothing Jewish about that trick. Non-Jews do it just as much. They smear people as Nazi or Hitler apologist. It's the dominant moral currency in the West. We have a new religion. It's the religion of the Second World War. So it is the quickest and easiest way to attack someone. That's why you got that very quick law of the internet, that anytime you have any kind of discussion that goes on for long on the internet, someone's going to invoke Hitler. So there's nothing peculiarly Jewish about it.
Maybe that's why Dan left him. You know, Sean seems like the kind of dirtbag that would employ the same sort of tricks, but maybe Dan's above that, or they could be working together on a new endeavor. I don't know. But just while we're on this, Jewish supremacy, chosen people syndrome, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure you noticed even when you were a Seventh-day Adventist, master race was bad. You know, white supremacy was bad, but Jewish chosenness was like sort of woven into the cake there. It's just ridiculous. And that kind of brings me to wanting to kind of get your thoughts on freaking Jews, man, spending millions upon millions upon millions of dollars to geofence unsuspecting Christians at their college campuses and at their houses of worship, just so they can propagandize them with October 7th experience bullshit. I mean, can you imagine one group of people, a religious group of people, weaponizing another religious group of people's own fucking phone against them for propaganda purposes? I mean, that's so beyond the pale. I want you to speak to.
Yeah. Can you name any form of life that does not try to shape the niche around it?
No, you get what I'm saying. What
yeah,
kind
every
of
single form of life does this, but for you, it's outrageous when Jews do it. But what about when slugs do it?
Again,
what about when House Ponce do it?
The Seventh-day Adventist side of yours can't see the dirty, underhanded sliminess.
Okay,
of these
answer my
Jewish
question.
tactics.
Answer my question. What form of life does not do this?
Non-pond scum?
Any form of life. Name me a single form of life that does not construct the niche around it.
Well, I mean, it's been rolled out in 4 states. You know, California. You're out there.
Again, you're not answering my question. Name a form of life that does not engage in niche construction.
I would say white men in America, 2025. You tell me where we're pulling anything like that bullshit.
Well, they don't try to shape their neighborhoods in their own interests. So if white men are on the left, they try to make a more left-wing community and a more left-wing nation. If white men are on the right, they try to align America with the right. Different groups have different interests, and so all groups pursue their interests, whether they are snails, whether they are beavers, whether they're Jews, whether they're blacks. Every single group is trying to shape the niche around it it's their own interest. Christians do this, Muslims do it, blacks do it, homosexuals do it, white men do it. Every group tries to make a world that is best for them. So I don't see what's particularly Jewish about it when lions do it, tigers do it. Every single form of life does this.
Oh, I don't know. It just, as you were just talking, your show is a visual. It's not just audio. So I could see the twinkle in your eye when you spoke of those pagers maybe last year. And here we are again.
I love it when
here we are again with
terrorists get hurt.
electronics. Here we are again with electronics. And what these Christians do to these, what these Christians do to you Jews? What the fuck do they do? Why do they deserve that? Why do they deserve it? It's going on right now.
Every group has a victimization story. Name me a group that doesn't have a victimization story.
Okay, let's change gears. You're going to avoid.
No.
You're going to avoid
Answer
the
my
shittiness.
question. Name me one single group that doesn't have a victimization.
My group, white.
You seem to. You have a huge victimization story. White men have a victimization. You have a huge victimization story. You're furious about your grievances, and
I'm not furious.
I don't deny that.
I'm furious. Maybe young straight white males getting shit on by corporations and their own damn government. Yeah, I'm a little bit pissed off about that. But would I go by
and which group?
Would I geofence Democrats and propagandize them? What kind of slimy shit is that?
But you would never try to change the world to make it more amenable to your hero system.
Okay. Well, let's put it this way: white guys, like if you'll know, there's some stupid black guy named Officer Tatum. He's got a site on YouTube, probably got 500,000 viewers. He's another member of the Hasbara 7,000 Club. But like Tommy Robinson and like James Lindsay and all these other losers, sellouts, he went to kiss the wall. And I remember him giving his interview with an Israeli Jew over there. And he said, it was a great experience. I couldn't believe how advanced the place was. It was just like America. I was not expecting this. And the best part? Only one person spit on me while I was here. And that person was a young person, probably barely a teenager. So I didn't really hold that against the rest of the people. So I ask you, what the fuck is with all these shitty ass Jews spitting on the one group of Christians from America who keep them afloat? Like I told you, you're living on Section 8 land over there. What's with the spitting? Is that some rare form of we love you that we don't know, that has never left the desert? Please explain that to me, sir.
Yeah, different groups have different interests, and the more intense your in-group identity, the more likely you are to feel hostility towards out-group. So 99.999% of Jews do not spit on Christians, but a tiny, tiny percent of Jews engage in this kind of antisocial behavior, just as 99% of Christians don't go out there trying to cause Jews harm, but you have a tiny number of Christians who do nasty things to Jews. You really think that if we look at Christian behavior, it's just all sparkly and exemplary, and it's only perfidious Jews who ever engage in antisocial behavior? Every group has bad apples. Every group has parts of their history that are embarrassing. Every group does things that look horrible to outgroups. If you believe in your religion, then every other religion looks satanic. So if you're a Christian or Christian sympathetic, then Judaism and Islam seem satanic. If you're a Muslim, Christianity and Judaism seem satanic. So name me a group that doesn't engage in horrible antisocial behavior.
My group, straight white males, circa 2025.
They never do anything antisocial. They never murder, they never rape, they never cheat.
Never?
Well, I asked you a group that doesn't engage in antisocial behavior, given that 99.99% of Jews do not spit on Christians. So name me a group that is perfect.
When I call Jews the ultimate obfuscantists, the obscurantists, all we have to do is play back me and you talking to see.
Yeah, I asked you very clear questions that you can't answer. I asked you the most non-obscurantist questions that you can't answer.
Yeah,
you're the one who resorts to obscurantism.
All right.
You can't name me a single group that doesn't engage in any of the behaviors that you castigate Jews for.
Well, like I say, they are the ultimate. They are the ultimate, and the thing that I love is the fact that the Mark Levins and the Ben Shapiros, nobody's taking them off the air yet. They're still out there spewing, and I don't know what does somebody like you think when a Randy Fine is out there in a group with a group of young Republicans, and they're Jewish. They're all Jewish. They're young Jewish Republicans, and he's telling them all that we've been kicked out of everywhere we've ever lived, and it's never been our fault. Never been our fault. Could you imagine the drunk that's been kicked out of every place in LA and now in Burbank and all these other, he's kicked out everywhere in Orange County, and he's got 250 words in his lexicon for buying and selling and not one word for self-reflection. So we'll close that subject
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Because
Pretty much everyone I know doesn't engage in much serious introspection. Most people I know don't look at themselves as the fault, don't look at themselves as the agent that is at blame. Most groups and most individuals I know would rather do anything than take accountability for their actions. There's nothing particularly Jewish or Gentile or Christian. This is a human trait. We evolved to castigate out groups and to think the best of ourselves. If we engaged in serious moral introspection as an evolutionary default, we probably would not have survived.
you ever get on these Twitter spaces, Luke?
Rarely.
I know we're on one right now, but do you ever engage with them?
Almost never.
Okay. Earlier, I heard you talking about GDP, and I just wanted to give you a counterpoint that IMF put out some data last month called PPP, or I'm sorry, they put out GDP based upon PPP, purchasing price parity, and that basically means what your dollars will buy, what your yen will buy, whatever your currency will buy, as far as a basket of goods or whatever. And based on once they put the PPP over it, China is number one above America. Now you and I know they got more mouths to feed or whatever, but I was just telling you that I thought that was an interesting thing, and it leads to what I was gonna say on these Twitter spaces the other day. I heard some people talking about robots. They're thinking people are going to be replaced by robots. And I had to call them, because I don't keep things to myself. I called them and I said, if you mean, when you say robots, you mean like Asians who have robotic personalities, then I believe you're right. And that's why I used to call you every once in a while and kind of be in awe at the way you Australians had kept yourself free of Asians so far, because I made the point to you, 5 out of every 8 people on the fucking planet are in Asia. And I just think the future, you think about these American kids, last week we heard 600,000 Indians, 550,000 Chinese. I may have got those two numbers backwards, but we heard that Trump say himself that we were incapable for these jobs and we had to get these people and drag them here. And it really hit home to me that so many of our kids getting out of high school or college, they're already diagnosed with a condition. They got these fucking degrees in black studies and feminine studies and gay studies and all this bullshit that's basically worthless. And not only that, they're $100,000 in the hole. So I just feel like the future is going to be a bunch of robotic Asians who don't have these proclivities for medical diagnosis because they're psychologically fucked up, and they don't have $100,000 worth of debt. And I would just like to get your feedback. So now that we've passed my little Jewish gripe, and let you tell me you see the future of Asians like I do, uh, kind of doing well in a world where everybody else has kind of lost their way, or you think I'm overblowing the growth in the future of Asians? At least the smart ones, the Northeast Asians.
Right. The
Fire back at me.
Northeast Asians are among the smartest people in the world, with average IQs around 105 compared to Europeans with average IQs of 100. They tend to be more conformist. They tend to be more devoted to their families. They tend to earn more money than Europeans. They tend to be more educated. They tend to commit far fewer crimes. They have far lower rates of sexually transmitted diseases. There's no Western society that can approach the law-abidingness of Japan, right? No Christian society, no Jewish society has produced a society that commits as few violent crimes as Japan. The level of pro-social behavior by Japanese tourists abroad, where they pick up their own trash, where they obey the law, where they show respect for other people, is just incredible. I'm just a huge admirer of Japan. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't certain gifts that Europeans have, or certain gifts that Africans have that the Japanese do not have, right? Different groups have different gifts. And so I have a great deal of respect for the type of communities and countries that Japan and the Northeast Asians build. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to outcompete the rest of the world. So most of the world's innovations have come from Europeans. Most of the world's a disproportionate number of the world's celebrities are of African origin. So it's not like Japan, like the world's master race. You have different forms of life that have learned to adapt to different conditions, and the type of behaviors that led to adaptation and survival in Northeast Asia are different than the type of behaviors that led to the most evolutionary success in Africa or in South America. So that produces groups that create different types of communities and excel in different ways. So I don't expect Northeast Asia to lead the world in innovation.
Cool. So you agree with me that because of their robotic nature, that people predicting a world of robots, they may have looked beyond the robotic ability of the Asians to plug and play in virtually any scenario. You agree with that, don't you?
Well, I don't view the Asians as robotic, but compared to say the European norm, Asians are less emotionally expressive, less spontaneous, less wild. But compared to, say, the African norm, then whites seem robotic and repressed and buttoned down. So being a little bit more thoughtful and careful and less spontaneous in the things you do, it produces a different culture, which will have lower crime rates, more social cohesion, more family solidarity. People will generally make safer, wiser decisions than if they just act out spontaneously. But with the West's high level of spontaneity and maybe sociopathy and willingness to go their own way compared to the esteem of the group, that also creates incentives for more innovation that come from the West. So I don't like talking about people in good and bad terms. I just think different groups have different strengths and different weaknesses.
Yeah, yeah. But you see having so many of them, you know what I mean? And the fact that, I don't know. Yeah, I'm probably not the only one that realizes that a town like Hong Kong, people are stacked like 250,000 people per square mile. So, man, I don't know if you want to call that just orderly. Would it be malleable, orderly? I don't
Orderly,
know.
I think, is a good way to describe it. Look, I was on a bus in Australia that was absolutely jam-packed, and I felt almost no anxiety. In a bus that was half as full in Los Angeles, I would probably experience 10 times as much anxiety. So if you were jammed in with people who are like you and who are law-abiding, safe, polite, courteous, it is an entirely different perspective than a far more separated existence, but with people who are far more dangerous.
You ever seen those pictures of the dude in the Tokyo station with the hat on that has to push people into the subway with a stick because they got just a mass of humanity that has to use that transit system? It's amazing. But do you remember a thinker named I'm changing gears now. If you want to end our call now and pick it up next week, we can, or I can keep going. You want to keep going a little bit longer?
Yep.
Okay.
Go.
All right. You remember a thinker named Robert Anton Wilson? He's dead
Yes.
now. Been dead about. Okay. You do remember him, right?
Yep.
And I don't know. I heard some people in another space bitching about the current state of education. And I just remember Robert Anton Wilson used to talk about something called the jumping Jesus phenomenon, how he would talk about from 1 AD to 1500 AD, you could say the compendium of knowledge that had been built in that time period. He called one Jesus. He gave it a nomenclature as one Jesus. And then he said 1500 to say 1650 was two Jesus. And basically he was making the point, each change from one cheat Jesus to two Jesus to three Jesus, it kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And I just feel like and you remember you and I talked maybe about a year ago about maybe some Jew that was in charge of data and had talked about how the amount of data had actually doubled in less than a year. You remember
Vaguely,
highlighting that about a year ago, Luke?
maybe.
So when I think about the current state of education, this swamping, we've got to be, if you're going to use Robert Anton Wilson's nomenclature of one Jesus, we have to be at like 250 Jesus or 300 Jesus now. So when I think about, if you and I were running things, Luke, we would probably like roll things back to like a classical education. Well, think about it. That was back when they had like the compendium of knowledge was like 2 or 3 or 4 Jesus. Well, now they've got 256 Jesus. You see how there's so much data and information. There's a swamping going on there, and they're picking up garbage. They're having a hard time getting to the good stuff because they can't sift through all the garbage. Can you hit me back with a thought on that?
Well, yes, I think that American education is about the best in the world when you aggregate it by race. So people of African origin have the highest educational attainment on average in the United States compared to any other country, that people of Northeast Asian ancestry have about the highest educational attainment anywhere in the world in the United States. For all the problems with the American education system, it does a pretty good job with where it gets people. Our universities are about the best in the world. So we certainly have problems, but when you look at other countries and the results, the American schooling system does pretty well. But you have to separate it out by race, because different groups have different levels of inclinations to devote themselves to education.
Yeah, I remember, was it the 1860s that was it Horace Mann? They sent him maybe over to Prussia to study. They were fascinated by the orderliness of the Prussian soldiers, and basically kind of mocked our or mimicked their education system to try to create obedient workers here in America. And I just wonder now, in the current idiom in 2025, since we don't have any workers' barracks and we don't have a lot of factories for these people to be working at, what do you think they're optimizing for, Mr. Luke Ford? What do you think the
I still
education
think
is being
obedience. I still think obedience. Much of education is an education in being obedient. People who are obedient, who operate within the rules, who color within the lines, do far better in education than those who don't. People who follow the rules and are obedient generally do far better in the workplace. They generally do far better in life. So I see an education system that is tilted more and more towards the feminine virtues of following direction and just coloring within the lines. And this is what employers want. Right, the number one reason people are going to get fired is because they have become a liability, and you become a liability when you don't follow directions and order. So I still think, off the top of my head, that the same orderliness and following directions and being obedient is still the dominant goal of our education system.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know, the reason I think like people from say the late 1700s and 1800s seems like their thinking was a lot more high-minded. I think it goes back to maybe what Robert Anton Wilson was saying about being about this swamping of data, but also I also think back to Carl Jung. He said that man has been swamped by external objects. He used the term external objects, but I would add to that data. So let's say man's been swamped by external objects and data to the point that he was forgotten that the real prize, what Jung used to call the sine qua non of the world as an object, which he was talking about the human psyche, man's psyche, remains almost unexamined. So it's just weird because anytime I think history, I think there's like some sort of delineation where we seem to have found so many new things since 1850, but the thinking, the high-mindedness of their thinking was better before then. And I would just say just as simple as you could find an old Civil War letter to somebody's wife or girlfriend from the 1860s and compare that to someone from the Iraq War, and you could just tell that they're just thinking is different, you know. But anyway, that's about all I had. I'll let you get back to your game show.
Okay,
All
thanks,
right.
Kip. Take care,
Thanks, man. Bye. All right,
So-
bye.
Probably the highest IQ society that history has ever seen is probably ancient Athens, where probably, given the nature of its public entertainment, the plays that were performed in ancient Athens of, say, 2,400 years ago, we're looking at an average IQ, I don't know, of 120, something just unbelievable. All right, let's get a little bit more here from Hal Brands.
This decade. It doesn't mean that I'm not worried about the period beyond that, but I think this really is the stretch when there is the biggest risk of a no kidding hot war in the Western Pacific.
All right. So last extreme scenario question: what's the U.S. biggest weakness? I've read that some war games show us just running out of materiel. Like we simply can't make stuff. We can barely keep, Israel and Ukraine supplied with, say, anti-missile missiles and anti-drone equipment. Others might point to, you talk about a regional conflict. That's a nice thought. I'm assuming if and when it goes kinetic, suddenly a whole lot of electronic stuff right here at home fails, and that pipelines don't work, and that pumps don't work, and that a lot of home routers go down, and that we suddenly find ourselves brought to our knees in a way, to say nothing, by the way, of the last thing, which is rare earths are tough. Our pharmaceutical supply chain is fully coming through China. What do you see the U.S. Current biggest vulnerability that we really ought to be focusing on right now?
In many ways, Bruce, I think you answered your own question quite well. I mean, I tend to categorize this by saying that the U.S. has two glaring weaknesses in a Taiwan context. One is getting there, and the other one is going long. Right, getting there is hard because Taiwan is thousands of miles away from any military outpost in the continental United States. It's a long way even from Hawaii, and so the U.S. is heavily dependent, particularly in the early stages of a Taiwan conflict, on a relatively small number of big bases in places like Guam and Okinawa that are very vulnerable to Chinese missile attack.
Geography isn't everything, but it's almost everything in this type of discussion.
Now, fortunately, that is changing, and the Pentagon is opening up new areas from which to operate in the Central Pacific and the Western Pacific. It's playing with concepts like the Replicator Initiative, which is meant to use loitering munitions and drones and things like that to bring a lot of firepower to bear relatively quickly in the contested spaces of the Western Pacific. But the reality is still that the U.S. has to go a long way to bring power to bear to help Taiwan. And so there's going to be some period of time early in a Taiwan conflict, let's say it's a few weeks, where Taiwan is fighting mostly on its own. And that takes a lot of wherewithal and a lot of courage and a lot of.
I don't know about you. When I place myself in a different geography, I feel like a different person. When I get outside of LA, I feel like a different person. I feel like a different person in San Francisco compared to Portland, compared to Seattle, compared to Vancouver, compared to London or Paris. Geography just has such a profound effect on me. I just find that the things that concern me in LA don't tend to concern me in San Francisco or Portland or Vancouver. The conformist part of our discussion with Kip is in my mind that the older I get, the more I see how your life is just so much easier the more that you conform to the powers that be, the more that you conform to your tribe, the more that you conform to your work, the more that you conform to your school, the more that you conform to your social circle. Life just is so much easier as a conformist. I say this as a nonconformist who's paid a huge price for being a nonconformist. Everything just goes so much easier. Relationships, family, schooling, income, work, everything goes easier the more that you conform. So an expression of how out of touch with reality I have often been. Around 1985, my brother asked me, what do you plan to do for work in your career? So I was 18 or 19. At the time, I had a contract to clean the Boyne Island shopping center and to do the gardening there. And I would buy the Australian newspaper every day. And there was a major cricket series that Australia was hosting the West Indies. And I loved the cricket commentary of this English writer, Henry Blofeld, right? His nickname's Blowers, and he'd be featured in the Australian. And Australia just had a smashing day 2, stunning victory over England in the first test match. And Blowers is still at it, right? I told my brother, I'm going to become like Henry Blofeld. I'm going to make my living traveling around the world commenting on cricket.
Innings like it. Travis Head was the batsman. And Australia needed 205 to win, the biggest score of the match. And it really seemed at that stage that England had a very, very good chance. They had 3 days and 1 session, can you believe it, to get the runs, Australia, and it took them just 1 session. There were so many extraordinary factors. The pitch after tea was easier than at any time in the match. Why? Goodness knows. Did the England bowlers not use it? There was a bit of that, probably. A bit of the dominating batsmanship made the pitch look easier. It was extraordinary. But Travis Head, unbelievable. He made 123 in just 83 balls, reaching his 100 in 67 balls with 12 fours and 4 sixes. And that was at the equal...
Good old Blowers. This book I just found stunning. Why Religion Became Obsolete. It's by a sociologist at Notre Dame, a Christian. It's a very Protestant Christian focused book, but so much thought-provoking material.
There's lots of complexity involved in all this. I argue that almost all the forces were unintended. So if you think about planned obsolescence in products and so on, this was not planned. Almost all the forces and developments and agents involved in this were not like, let's see how we can, flush religion down the toilet. They were concerned about other things. They were unintended consequences of what they were up to. So this is partly in contrast, I spell out in the book, conservative religious people have a tendency to think the world is against us. The secular humanists are our enemies, and they're actively, there's a little bit of that at work here, but that's really very small part of the larger story. Most of it is unintended obsolescence. Most of it is unrelated to religion, per se.
So religious people, like non-religious people, prefer to blame their problems on outsiders. Right? It's not a uniquely Jewish or Christian or white or black thing. Right? Every group prefers to blame their problems on outsiders.
Hey, as part of that, it's about demographic changes, technological changes, economic changes, geopolitical changes, wars, and academic theories, other things not directly about religion. My story also tries to situate it very much specifically in the American context. I'm not somebody who thinks these processes operate as social laws wherever they sort of descend in any society. It very much depends on a particular context, a particular history, particular cultural trajectory. So a lot of these, some of the forces like the digital revolution are...
So I bought his book on Audible and went through it, and it's amazing. And then the next book I tackled is called Spellbound. And it's about a history, how charisma shaped American history from the Puritans to Donald Trump. And the author, a professor of history, Molly Worthen, she was secular and she recently converted to Christianity. And it's another excellent book.
And inspiring oratory showed up here and there in the people I found myself writing about, but really more in the breach than as part of the broad pattern. I realized that the key giveaway of charisma is its deeply polarizing effect on people. Charismatic leaders have a lot of people who adore them and a lot of people who loathe them, and not very many who are just lukewarm. Let me give you the definition of charisma that I finally settled on. Charisma is a relationship between leaders and followers based on telling a story. A charismatic leader invites followers into a compelling narrative that does a better job of making sense of their lives than other narratives on offer in the culture. But if you happen...
So the better your life, the less need you have for a narrative. The worse your life, the more desperate you are for meaning and for some kind of narrative that will make sense of why you're not thriving. Right? The more freedom you have, then the more painful your failures are going to be. If you live in a free country like the United States, you've got above average IQ, you would think that you'd be thriving. If instead you're failing, right, then you have a desperate need for a narrative that makes sense of your failing life. The more painful failure becomes, the more freedom you have.
To be outside of that story, then this leader is baffling and maybe even revolting. I've noticed that when we are on the outside of charismatic relationships, a lot of us, even totally secular people, tend to resort to religious or hypnotism metaphors. We use words like mesmerize, magnetize. We talk about a leader converting followers to a cause. And I think this is because charisma is a concept that we punt to when we can't identify an obvious, rational, kind of quid pro quo relationship between the leader and followers that explains the appeal to us. We have a sense that there is something else going on, and we just don't understand it. This is why the sociologist Max Weber borrowed the term charisma.
So charisma plays a much bigger role in American life than in any other developed country by far, because Americans, compared to any other developed country, have less social cohesion, less social trust, they're more isolated, and they have, therefore, a greater need for a narrative to make sense of their lives. If your life is flowing, if your life is going well, you don't need any narrative to make sense of things. But if you feel disconnected, isolated, lonely, you are desperate for a narrative, for an explanation that tells you, why are you in pain? And so the author of Spellbound talks about the power of narrative to make people feel better. And then another perspective is offered by sociologist Randall Collins in a sexy book named Interaction Ritual Chains. So the Molly Worthen analysis is charisma comes from a powerful narrative. Randall Collins' analysis is charisma is not a personal trait, as a product of high energy interaction rituals. And because Americans are so comparatively isolated, less social cohesion, less social trust, less bonds and connections with other people compared to those in other developed countries, Americans are more in need of high energy interaction rituals. So when people gather, when people share an attention space, share a narrative, share a focus on the same symbolic object, such as football or a religious ritual, when people then gather together, sync their emotions, and then feel lifted beyond their normal selves, they generate emotional energy. And Americans are more in need of emotional energy than any other people because their lives are so individualist and lacking in social trust and social cohesion compared to other developed countries. Now, if there's a person who helps to generate that energy, he's called charismatic. Nick Fuentes generates energy for his devotees. Donald Trump generates energy. Ronald Reagan generated energy for their followers. So the charismatic figure has a narrative that resonates, and then a series of rituals where attention is shared. The shared grievance, the shared hope, the shared beliefs about what's wrong, the shared beliefs about what will fix things. Right, that develops emotional energy when you share in these rituals, and these ritual chains accumulate, and they give people strength and energy. I don't think it's a coincidence that traditional Jewish life is so ritualistic, and Jews have so much energy. the more religious the Jew, the less likely you are to see him strolling down the street, right? The more traditional, the more devoted to Judaism, the more observant the Jew, the more he is pushing, rushing, running around, just has an incredibly full, energized life, because he is constantly refueled by his shared rituals with members of his tribe. So in America, with its individualism, there's this desperate need for things to bring people together and bond people. So you have shared rituals and narratives about the chosen nation, the frontier, the expert savior, the populist deliverer. Now, when rituals lose their intensity, when audiences fragment, when new rituals rise, you have charisma crash. So when the leader fails to generate emotional energy, right, you can call this a loss, a scandal, but people are moving on. The structure has run out of fuel, right? The Joe Biden machine ran out of fuel because Joe Biden did not generate energy among his followers. Hillary Clinton did not generate much energy among her followers, while Donald Trump generated energy for his followers. So you have individuals such as a Trump who come along and articulate a story that meets people's needs. The crowd is primed, the crowd is focused, and the crowd is emotionally aligned. So it's not the leader who just creates this story and this emotional energy. It's the interaction. It's what's shared between the leader and his audience. So charisma depends on two things: a story that commands attention and a crowd, a public ready to be energized by that story. So Donald Trump doesn't just create energy on his own. It's part of a circuit between him and his followers.
From the world of biblical studies and church history a little bit more than 100 years ago. It comes originally from the ancient Greek word charis, meaning divine anointing, chosenness by the gods. In the New Testament, Paul makes this charisma, he adds the suffix, and it has slightly different meanings in different parts of the New Testament.
Okay, a question from the chat. Tikkun Olam is commonly presented. Is this about making the world better for everyone or for Jewish people only? So pretty much the only Jews who talk about Tikkun Olam are overwhelmingly secular Jews with a universalist focus. So the more traditional the Jew, the more tribal the Jew, the more religious the Jew, the more committed the Jew is to Judaism, the less he talks about Tikkun Olam. So there is, throughout the Jewish tradition, two tracks. There's a global image and there is a concern with the tribe. Usually, the more intense your in-group identity, whether you're Christian or Jewish, black or white, gay or straight, right, the more focused you are on your in-group. But even with the most intensely in-group devoted Jews, there is recognition that God is the God of all people, and that there will be an ultimate redemption, not just for Jews, but for the entire world. But talking about Tikkun Olam is overwhelmingly something that's done by secular Jews, just like fighting anti-Semitism. There's no basis in Judaism, in the Torah tradition, about any kind of mitzvah to go out and fight anti-Semitism. This is not something that traditional Jews talk about. It's not a focus. It might be a money maker for people who want to play that particular game. But these things like Tikkun Olam and fighting anti-Semitism, these are not concerns of your normal traditional Jew. The more a Jew is rooted in Torah, the more a Jew is rooted in divine commandments, the less concern he has with Tikkun Olam and fighting anti-Semitism.
But generally it means unbidden gift of grace from God. Weber is the one who deserves credit for taking this term, which at the time was, languishing as a sort of a term that you'd know if you were a Bible nerd or sort of in church circles, but otherwise not, and taking it and kind of redefining it as a type of political authority distinct from.
So I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist, and we were one of the few religions that was essentially dominantly founded by a woman. And Ellen G. White came along, and she would have these visions that just so happened to coincide with whatever the leading men in the denomination had decided. And so she rose to power on the basis of her claims of having divine visions. And I'm sure she was just completely indifferent to the fame and the applause and the power that these divine visions would give her. So a lot of people claim divine visions because there are all sorts of incentives when you're dealing with a particular crowd to claim that you've got some kind of unique connection to the divine. And it's a fascinating story for certain people. So after World War II, you had the age of the experts, where America increasingly revered experts and the academy and credentials, right? This was the anti-fascist way to go, right? What could be less fascist than turning things over to experts? It's interesting that any alternative to liberal pluralism, rule by experts, follow the science, is almost immediately castigated as fascist, because that's the go-to veto by our ruling elite. So in the aftermath of World War II, trusting the experts became the appealing antidote to the virus of fascist agitation. It just seems so bizarre that any lack of deference to experts very quickly becomes called fascist. And we had the rise of the expert class in late 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. And these experts didn't have the grand oratory, and they didn't necessarily charm the media, but they had a narrative. They had a story about America's future. And they urged Americans to invest in higher education, to pursue advanced degrees, and to venerate institutional prestige, right? These were all proxies for wisdom and moral righteousness, to trust the science, to trust certification, to trust the experts and the high priests of data. So we often talk about experts as if they're the opposite of charisma, but in the mid-century United States, our country was run on a special type of charismatic story: salvation through expertise, through science, right? And these experts, and this means people on the left. This is why the experts and the leftists, they do not tend to be as campy, flamboyant, and theatrical as the talking heads on the right, right? Their charisma comes from their promise of science and safety and credentials, that they're going to tame the chaos of the world through specialization and expertise. And after the Depression, the war, and genocide, and all this nasty stuff, the communists and the fascists, right, a story came along that said, trust the data, trust the science, trust the universities, trust the planner, trust the person with the advanced degree. That felt like a lifeline to sanity. So even expert governance depends on vibes. It depends on an emotional resonance between those claiming expertise and those who defer to expertise, right? It depends on people believing that we have an elite expert class that has the intelligence and the humility to lead the country. When that belief cracks, right, the charisma of expertise evaporates, because even claims of expertise and needs a narrative. You can't just present facts. You have to tell a story, the story of the future. And American technocrats did this brilliantly from the New Deal through to the space age, right? They sold order, growth, rationality, upward mobility. But then when it became increasingly clear that they weren't so neutral with their expertise, and they weren't so civically minded as they claimed, their prestige collapsed, right? Expert charisma depends on institutional prestige. When people stop trusting institutions, they stop trusting the experts put forward by institutions. So the worship of this secular expert was a substitute for the older religious charisma, where people would venerate clergy, or they would venerate a military hero. But when any group overclaims, overly moralizes, claims that any dissent is ignorance or bigotry, start talking down to people, right, that arrogance will break the spell. So America is now shifting from an age of expert charisma to an age of competing charisma stories. We've got the influencer charisma, the Nick Fuentes charisma, the Ben Shapiro charisma, the grievance charisma, the guru charisma. We've got network charisma, technology charisma, spiritual therapeutic charisma, Oprah charisma. So right now, no one story has replaced the old trust the experts, trust the science narrative. So right now, the country feels cracked open and disoriented.
Authority that comes via a leader's position in an institution, or relation to tradition, or military might. Power that has to do with a leader convincing followers that he or she has some supernatural capability, a power that resides in a special way in the leader as a person. To me, the phenomenon that Weber and secular observers after him have tried to name is actually not all that far from what Paul was naming in the New Testament. I think in both the religious and in the secular sense. Charisma is really about the human desire to touch otherworldly power.
The human desire for transcendence, the human desire for order, a human desire to make sense of things. And the more desperate your life, the more desperate this appeal. Right? People usually change their religion, make dramatic changes to their hero system because their life is not working. That certainly is what has driven me. So why do we have this common narrative? You either trust the science, you either trust the experts, or you're a fascist. Right? It's an old pattern, and it simplifies the world. It gives people an identity. But there are a lot of other ways to develop a good story aside from technocracy or fascism. But life runs on shortcuts, right? People don't have time to sort through existential issues. People don't have the time or the interest to sort through 20 competing frameworks. So politics collapses into two poles, the populist fascist nationalist pole or the rule by experts pole. And the more left you go in politics, the more deference is given to experts. So in communism, you have much more rule by experts than in socialism, which has much more rule by experts than in social democracy. The trust the science, trust the experts crowd, they need a story and they need a villain. So if you make your claims based on your competence, your charts, your process, your degrees, your certifications, right, you need to frame the alternative as chaos, fascism, rage, demagoguery. Populists need an enemy too, right? We all want to be able to blame our problems on someone else. So after World War II, the reflex was you need to train people to see fascism and nationalism as the disaster to avoid at all costs. And experts use that fear to build their legitimacy. Trust us so the nightmare never returns. And that cultural reflex still lingers. Right? Our institutions may be hollowed out, but our rhetoric hasn't. We still have this old expert versus fascist framing. And it's the template that people reach for when things feel unstable because there's no widely accepted middle narrative. We don't right now have a coherent replacement that says we need competence, but we also need humility and accountability. So the biggest threat is not fascism or technocracy. It's institutional drift and public distrust. It's a culture where experts overclaim, populists overheat, and ordinary people stop believing in any authority. So charisma is not a personality trait as much as a process. It's a workaround. We want to be able to make sense of a confusing world. We like control, but we also want to hand it off. Yeah, we want to steer our lives, but we also want someone else to tell us what our lives mean. And charisma is a ritual we use to solve our problems. America is a Reformation country, right? A Protestant country. We never had a stable priestly class to keep our charismatic impulses in bounds. We've had endless Protestant sects, endless movements, endless people claiming to be prophets and to have divine visions. And only in such a setting can charisma play such an enormous role. Charisma plays a much bigger role in American social, cultural, political life than in any other developed country. America has a much greater devotion to self-help than any other country. Americans have extravagantly friendly churches as these replacements for what used to be genuine community, because Americans don't usually experience a genuine sense of rootedness and community. They have to make exaggerated efforts to try to create some kind of simulacra of that, say, through their churches.
And to find a place in a big, transcendent narrative that lends meaning to your ordinary, puny life and gives you some sense of control over the chaos. And maybe you are not the one in control, but at least you have reasonable confidence that you know where it's headed. And whether you...
When your life is painful, when your life is failing, freedom becomes an indictment of you. And most people want to flee from that indictment.
Find a leader compelling or revolting depends on whether he or she is offering you an...
So freedom, when you're failing, is an indictment. It exposes you. It strips away your excuses. It tells you that there's something lacking in you, and people don't like that. Right? People want freedom with buffers. They only want to take responsibility for the good things that they do. They don't want to take responsibility for the bad things that they do. So a charismatic leader will offer you release from this indictment. He'll tell you the game is rigged, that your struggles are not your fault. Your frustrations just confirm your clarity. Yeah, you may be losing at life, but at least you see through the bullshit.
Attractive role in the story he's telling. I want to add a caveat here. When I call a leader's message a story, I'm not saying it's necessarily fiction. And that can be
I grew up in Australia where there's a tradition of mateship, where blokes bond with each other, look out for each other, and there's just not the same level of mateship in the United States unless you go into an intensely in-group devoted community such as Orthodox Judaism. Right? In Orthodox Judaism, there are male-only spaces. There is much more of what we call in Australia mateship. There are fewer economic protections in America, so that creates great anxiety. If you get sick, you don't have adequate health insurance, you can be plunged into bankruptcy. And so conspiracy theories, charismatic leaders, all play into this widespread American anxiety, a country with increasingly weak institutions, with very few shared stories, high emotional volatility. And so the easiest way to get an appealing story is through abductive logic, right? That's the logic of the detective. You take all these different things that don't make any sense and then you form them into a story. It's the simplest explanation for what's going on. And so abductive logic is what dominates the most popular narratives, right? They offer the thing that people crave the most when life is the most incoherent and chaotic, right? A frame that makes sense of everything. And that's what Nick Fuentes, for example, offers to his crowd. Here's a framework for making sense of the world.
Well, it looks like all the screaming about Nick Fuentes on the internet is finally dying down a little bit. It couldn't go on forever, though it seemed like it might. And that's a good thing because, after all, there's a lot else going on in the world, some of it important, and watching people day after day stand up to basically make the same point, I'm a good person, unlike him, not that interesting or edifying or even really informative. I mean, we definitely learned that there are quite a few professional conservatives who are not that conservative in any sense that really matters. Some of them are fraudulent or sad or kind of stuck in nonprofit jobs because they can't get another, and your sympathy goes out to them, but listening to them talk day after day really didn't teach us anything. But it doesn't mean that there aren't lessons to be learned. In fact, there's one really important lesson, and this was really the reason to interview Nick Fuentes in the first place. And the lesson is that a lot of young men in America, mostly white, but not exclusively, listen to Nick Fuentes really carefully.
And the chat says, Luke, so who's the one talking trash and who's talking truth? Is it Nick? Is it Ben? Is it Tucker? All of them at times say something true. All of them at times say ridiculous things. I don't believe in good guys and bad guys. There are situations where Nick is the funnier, more insightful. There are other situations where Nick is the most irresponsible and vicious and antisocial. Right? They all have their time and place. Right? I don't usually divide the world into good guys and bad guys. They're also working in different genres, right? The Ben Shapiro genre is different from the Tucker genre, which is different from the Nick genre. Nick's working in the gamer genre. Tucker is working in the Christian confession genre. Ben Shapiro is working in claims of facts and logic, right? Claiming to offer clarity in a confusing world, right? They're all offering different narratives.
And the lesson that our professional bettors in Washington have drawn over the past few weeks is that means they're as bad as Nick Fuentes. They're Nazis too. But of course, they're not Nazis by and large. They're just American young people. And so the question is, and it's a pressing question if you care about the future of the country, why have they been listening to Nick Fuentes? Sincerely, like, what is this? Why aren't they listening to somebody from the Heritage Foundation or the Daily Wire? Why do they believe Nick Fuentes more than they believe the people who think they ought to have a monopoly on the attention of young conservatives? That is a really important question. And what does it say, not simply about their attitudes, but about the problems they face, the society they grew up in, the future they imagine for themselves? What does it say about all of that Fuentes is so popular among young men? After all, young men really are kind of the basis of our hope for continuing as a country. So if they're off in some direction that you don't understand, it's probably incumbent on you to try to understand it to the extent you can. You know, it's hard to understand other people's motives, and it's even harder when they're in a different generation. But making a good faith effort to figure out what is this, well, that's on us. Us being, you know, everyone with a job who's not in that generation. All the beneficiaries of a stronger, more cohesive America, the America we grew up in, which doesn't exist anymore. It's our responsibility to look at newer generations and say, what's going on with them? Can we help in any way? If we care about our country, if we care about our own families, our children and grandchildren, we probably want to do that. And it's probably not enough to call them names. It doesn't work, for one thing. It just makes whatever we claim to dislike even stronger. There's one lesson of the Trump 2015 announcement and everything that's happened since then, the last 10 years, it's that. And the lesson, obviously, is that when every power center in the country declares war on you, you become a power center. It doesn't destroy you. It makes you stronger. It's certainly true for Donald Trump. Would he have become president in 2016 and 2024 if all the cool kids hadn't denounced him as a Nazi? Probably not. Would he have been reelected if the FBI hadn't raided Mar-a-Lago and gone through his wife's underwear drawer? We can debate it, but maybe not. Maybe this would be the Ron DeSantis presidency. Probably. So attacking people, particularly when you attack them ad hominem, when you don't try to deconstruct or rebut the arguments they're making, but just calling them names, Nazi, that's counterproductive every single time. You expose yourself as hysterical and shallow, and you elevate them in the minds of everybody else. They're important enough to be yelled at by every trustee at the Heritage Foundation or whatever. They must be important. So again, it doesn't work, but it's also on a deeper level kind of immoral. It's immoral to dismiss the concerns of your countrymen as beneath consideration. I don't have to listen to you because you like some guy who's got ugly views. And by the way, it's not a defense of all of Fuentes' views. We interviewed him on the show and said it is totally immoral to hate Jews as a group because it's totally immoral to hate any group, period. That's always wrong. But it doesn't mean that everything Fuentes says is wrong. It's not wrong. And more to the point, what he says on the air and his huge popularity, which has only increased the more these people scream at him, says a lot about the people who are listening and their legitimate concerns and the factors in our society in America and the West that gave rise to their attitudes. Like, how did this happen? Let's, for once, in the last 20 years, look back and ask ourselves an honest question. How did this happen? Let's do what we didn't do when we withdrew from Afghanistan or declared a truce in Iraq or carted away the rubble from 9/11. We never asked, how did this happen? And no one was ever held responsible for allowing it to happen or the bad decisions that made it happen. Not one person. And so, of course, inevitably, disasters followed disasters. Because if you never take the time to take responsibility for what you've done or even understand it, you're apt to repeat it. It's the most obvious observation in the world. It's the basis of good parenting. It's why you make your kids apologize, of course. So let's, in the case of Nick Fuentes, focus not on Nick Fuentes, but on the people who watch Nick Fuentes. What kind of world have they grown up in? These young white men. Well, they've grown up in, over the last 10 years, a world that hates them. And not in a subtle way. Openly, with a Hutu-like directness and ferocity. They've grown up in a country that has systematically, in law, excluded them from the workplace, from education, from federal grants, and has told them again and again and again, no, we're not discriminating against you, and yes, you deserve it. Imagine growing up like that. And again, this isn't behind the scenes. This is way out in the open. And not only has it done exactly that to young white men, of course, white men being the one group who are officially excluded under DEI. There's only one, it's white men, white straight men. It's not whining. And by the way, this happens to be the one.
So I think Tucker is touching on some important truths here, but the dumbest part of this type of analysis is imagining that there's any group or any individual who doesn't have vulnerability. And you see this shown in the stunning fall in social status of Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, former president of Harvard University, and just someone who's been drubbed out of all his public positions over the past week when the Jeffrey Epstein emails came out, when Larry Summers, who was married, was asking Jeffrey Epstein how to seduce a mentee. All right, so there's this dumb notion among many populists and people with skeptical, critical, hateful views towards the elites that elites have no vulnerabilities. But it's not true, all right? Everyone lives within a contingent situation where if something changes, everything that was protecting them can fall apart. So Larry Summers seemed like the most elite, powerful person in his club, right? He was president of Harvard. He ran the World Bank. He ran the Treasury. He was huge, right? And he was connected. He was outspoken. But these emails come out with him corresponding with Jeffrey Epstein, and all his public titles have been taken away. Institutions and your peers will protect you until they don't. Reputations collapse overnight because prestige is brittle. Everyone's vulnerable. Everybody hurts, right? And Larry Summers has done so many good things in his life. He has such an impressive track record. But all people are thinking about right now are his emails where he asked Jeffrey Epstein how to seduce a mentee. So the more prestige you have, in some ways, the more insulated you are from life and its pain. But in other ways, the more vulnerable you are. So a plumber can say many things that the president of Harvard cannot get away with saying. Right? Your vulnerability will grow with your status. So in some ways, you'll become less vulnerable, but in other ways, you'll become more vulnerable. Right? The more reputation you bank, the more there is to lose. Right? Once people depend on their spotless image to justify their influence and status, right, then they become much more vulnerable to any crack in that presentation. So the more high status the environment, the less tolerance there is for liability. Elite institutions are not sentimental. They manage risk. Whether you're a professor, a CEO, a public intellectual, as soon as you become a PR threat, institutions cut ties. Right? It's not because your colleagues now think that you're evil, but institutions want to preserve themselves. Prestige also creates enemies and resentment. People watch those on top more closely than they watch those in the middle and the bottom. They envy them. They look for signs of vulnerability, and once there is an opportunity to take someone down, right, the pylon becomes quite easy and pleasurable. Right? Narratives around high status people could just flip overnight. Right? Yesterday's confidence becomes arrogance. Yesterday's risk-taking boldness becomes recklessness. Right? Low status people can quietly reinvent themselves in a way that high status people cannot. Right? There's no off-ramp when you're high status. No anonymity. Right? Everything you do is time-stamped, archived, available to be rediscovered. Your friends hesitate to protect you because they worry about their own reputation being contaminated. They calculate the optics. Right? Prestige networks cooperate when people are rising in power, and they are brutally transactional during the fall. Right? So you get more reach, the more prestige you have, but simultaneously you become more fragile and more vulnerable. You rise with your reputation and you fall with your reputation. You might think that high status and prestige increases your freedom, and probably does in some ways. It also narrows and restricts it. Right? The more prestige you have, the more status you have, the more power you have, the more weight that your words carry. Right? That sounds empowering, but it carries risk and vulnerability. So people start self-editating. They anticipate the blowback. They become polite and coded and careful. Low prestige means you can talk like a human being. right? If you're a plumber, a bartender, a truck driver, a freelancer, you can say what you want. People might argue with you, but you're less likely to lose your livelihood. So if you rise in prestige, you are trading your freedom for influence. You gain reach, you lose freedom and spontaneity. That's why people on the top use euphemisms. They're much more careful. They outsource their real thoughts to off-the-record conversations. They hide behind institutions and institutional language. They dodge controversy because they know one wrong sentence can collapse 10 years of accumulated goodwill. Right? The guy with no social capital can fire off a blunt take on X and move on with his day. So lower your status, the more your freedom of speech. The higher your status, the less freedom of speech, right? Larry Summers was a plumber who was trying to bang his mentee, and he turned to a pimp for advice, and his community of plumbers found out about it. He probably wouldn't become persona non grata in his community.
Group in America who, by and large, have been taught for cultural reasons, don't whine. Don't talk about yourself so much. No one wants to hear your story, and whatever you do, don't be the victim. All of that's good advice, by the way. But this group has not only been excluded with the force of law by the Justice Department in every...
So I love the left-wing podcast, If Books Could Kill. I'm excited to hear that they've done an episode on Dale Carnegie. Because of my lack of social skills, because of my lack of empathy for other people, because of my series of crises, because I couldn't maintain good relations with those around me, I was often urged to read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And Dale Carnegie gives a lot of good techniques, but if you're not fundamentally someone who is a blessing to those around him, right, all those techniques aren't going to do much good. Right, I was a huge devotee of self-help and didn't really help me much. So the more status you have, the more power you have, the more elite your life, right? The larger the number of people who can be harmed by your mistakes. Right? Ordinary people, low status people aren't symbols. Elites are symbols, right? Larry Summers is not just one guy. He represents Harvard, the Treasury, serious economics, meritocracy, technocracy. So when someone who symbolizes these worlds behaves badly, it becomes a referendum on the entire system. So the system has to protect itself by ejecting the offending symbol, right? If a plumber does bad things, nobody reads it as proof that the plumbing profession is corrupt, right? It doesn't implicate an entire worldview. It doesn't challenge a status hierarchy. It's just one person behaving badly. The higher you climb, the less private your life becomes. The more symbolic you are, the more your fall from grace will be public. The more trust you're granted, the harsher the punishment when that trust cracks. Plumber's mistakes remain personal. Larry Summers' mistakes became political, institutional, cultural.
Every state and at every college and university, with maybe 3 exceptions, they've been mocked and attacked and lectured and harangued and screamed at. Every bookstore in America had books on display. Whiteness is the problem. Well, what if you're white? What if you're like 19 and you're thinking about how do I make my way in this increasingly competitive, maybe even ruthless country? And everywhere I go, people are telling me I'm bad because of the way I was born. What effect would that have on you? And then you flip on the tube or the internet, and all these people with big jobs making big salaries who have the implied moral authority of their positions are telling you you're bad because of your skin color. And by the way, this is not a guess. Here's an example.
We have systemic...
So the British have a phrase that's particularly telling in this area. I'm going to have to cut you, old boy. Right? That's the polite British way of saying you've become reputationally radioactive. I cannot afford to be seen with you. I remember I was at a Reform synagogue and a cantor was up front asking a question and answer. And I said to him, most people don't like cantorial music. It's boring. Why can't we have more congregational singing? And everyone that I was sitting with moved away from me. Like I lost the whole crowd. And that has happened to me again and again for blurting out impolitic things.
Racism in the United States of America. It exists today. And it's a white man's problem. White men are responsible for it, not black men.
And we have stood by to see mediocre, mealy-mouthed, snowflake white men who are incapable of taking critique, who are willing to dole out infamous repudiations of the humanity of the other, and yet they call us snowflakes, and they are the biggest flakes of snow to hit the earth.
American history is one in which white Americans, by and large, have been taught to have indifference or even contempt for Black life. We have defined the country as a white nation where people of color are here on a guest pass.
1 in 3 Americans are racists. 1 in 3 Americans are terrified that this country by the year 2040 is not going to be majority white.
There has been no oppression for the white man in this country. And don't let it escape you that it is white men on this side of the aisle telling us, people of color on this side of the aisle, that y'all are the ones being oppressed.
Wake up, white men. What the fuck is wrong with you? And you're just eating it up. Oh, my God. Look at what they're doing. All of a sudden, my heritage is going to be over, that I want to live in a country where their white kids go to white schools and white people marry each other. What is wrong with that? I want to grow up in the country that my great-grandfather grew up in. That country doesn't exist anymore, asshole.
So you can see why there probably are some Nick Fuentes viewers who are a little confused when they hear themselves attacked as...
So Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, myself, we're all competing in the charisma economy, right? People like Tucker and Nick and Ben, they offer many prayers every day, right? They craft a particular emotional world and the audience joins the ritual. So people don't listen to Nick and Tucker and Ben primarily for the ideas, but it's for the emotions, the language, the signals, the insider jokes, the sense that you are understood, that you are noticed, that you matter. People like Nick and Tucker and Ben offer stories where their listeners are the heroes, right? You are the true hero. And you can play a role in taking back America. It's a war for attention. It's a war for meaning. So Nick and Ben and Tucker, they're not primarily arguing ideas. They're primarily offering stories. They are primarily offering reassurance, a sense of clarity in a confusing and chaotic world. They tell their audience, you are the ones who see through the BS. You're not fooled, right? So each show becomes a consecration of this alternative world, this alternative story, where members of this tribe are right and righteous, and the elites and their enemies are blind and wrong. So traditional sources of meaning have weakened. Christianity has declined in power. There's less social cohesion and social trust. People's lives are more painful, more atomized, and therefore there's more need for a story that makes them feel better, something that's soothing, a micro drama that taps into their most intense need that institutions and churches are not feeling and fixing. So people turn to Nick and to Ben to share in this particular emotion, to sense that they are being recognized, that their struggles fit into a bigger story. Right? Charisma is not just a property of leaders, it's a joint construction. The crowd is hungry, the leader supplies the story and creates a new world. So Fuentes, Shapiro, and Carlson are not primarily trading in arguments, they primarily trade in felt experience. In this sense of clarity at a time when people feel disoriented, atomized, and challenged by a chaotic world. So what is presented as a debate is really a ritual that binds their community together through shared emotion. So Nick and Tucker and Ben will say, oh, the elites are hiding something from you, they're lying to you, they're gaslighting you. Then the audience gets, one, the thrill of insider knowledge, two, a reassurance that their pain, their frustrations are legitimate. And that creates a strong bond. The host needs the audience to feel besieged. The more besieged and desperate the audience feels, the more intense they need the host. The host tells them their instincts, their pain is valid and heroic, so each side completes the other. There's a cadence to the show. There are villains outside, but we get it. Right? The host will pause. He'll deliver the verdict with a tone of weary authority. He's letting you in on a truth that he had to fight to uncover. And the audience experiences this as an initiation into a new world. Right? They're not just hearing a take. Right? They're stepping into a different reality, one that flatters them, that justifies them, that soothes them, that gives them a sense of independence and righteousness, and creates for them a community.
Racist. Racism is wrong. Of course, it is wrong. But they've grown up in a world where one of the leading CNN anchors is looking right into the camera and saying, what the fuck is wrong with you white people? You want to be near other white people? You want to have a heritage? You want to have white children? How dare you? The CNN anchor is married to a white guy. Whatever. But it's a little hard to tell people that racism is wrong when you're committing it. And again, it's not just a few people. It was our entire ruling class was lecturing us about how whiteness is a disease. It's a plague. It's inherently sinful. It's the source of all evil. The president of the United States stood up and said racism is the problem, and it's only committed by whites. It's a white man problem. Is racism only committed by whites? No, and everyone knows that. Hating other people.
So what's the appeal of a Nick Fuentes? He presents himself as a martyr, right? He says you can be despised, you can fail in life, you can be isolated, but that's only because you see through the BS. You're part of a righteous remnant, right? People don't listen to Nick for his compelling policy proposals, but he offers the emotional high of belonging to a persecuted tribe. Ben Shapiro has a different package. He says we're taming the libs, we're ridiculing the libs, we're trouncing the libs because we're rational, we're superior. So if you're a Ben Shapiro devotee, you feel, we think clearly in a fog of cultural confusion, right? Ben talks quickly, he performs confidence, he creates spectacles, what does he do? Schools the lib, destroys the libs, right? Never argues with his left-wing peers, right? He just performs these spectacles. Tucker Carlson creates intimacy, right? He invites you essentially into his home. He reveals what's really going on. He shares a confessional religious Christian story with you. He guides you towards the saving truth. So these pundit wars are not content battles, right? They're competing liturgies. Right? Each figure builds this small but intense, charismatic micro-world where the audience feels recognized, elevated, initiated, soothed, excited. People don't tune in to these guys for facts and for philosophical clarity, right? They tune in to hear that they matter, right? And charisma plays a bigger role in America than most places because people in America have a greater need for narrative. Why do they have a greater need for narrative? Because they are more atomized, they have less economic security, they have less social cohesion, social trust than any other developed nation of which I'm aware.
People is a human problem, one that every person struggles with, hopefully struggles against, because it's wrong. It's always wrong. Anti-Semitism is...
So we have the decline of Christianity, the decline of organized religion, because religion stopped meeting people's needs as effectively as other forms of comfort.
Global, but a number of them are quite local or are quite nationally situated. Okay, so at the end, so some of these forces, I'll just run down a list here. Some of the longer term forces, deinstitutionalization of marriage and family, that's the sociological term for
Let's bring
changes.
Michael back onto the show. What's going on, man?
40, how are you?
I am blessed. I'm blessed to have you in my life, bro.
Yeah, likewise. So I was listening to your show a couple weeks ago discussing like the grift of conservative media, which is a topic I'm always interested in. However, I don't know if I would put Rush Limbaugh in there the way that you did. And I happen to be reading a book about Rush Limbaugh, it's called Radio's Greatest of All Time, published 2022. And it made me realize that Rush Limbaugh was in it for the love of the game, really. And by that, I'm referring to radio. Like, he just loved doing radio. He was, you might know this, but prior to being a conservative talk radio guy, he was a DJ. Like in the 70s, he was just a DJ. And he tried to be funny, and he built a following by kind of doing practical jokes. And then it just kind of segued into conservative commentary.
Yeah, he loved radio. He was good at it, and he was a trailblazer. He was incredibly influential. If you evaluate him on his civic impact, then it's mixed. If you evaluate him on the terms of success and listeners, then he was sterling.
So, what do you mean by his civic impact? Are you well? In fact, I know that you're of a mind that talk radio is kind of toxic and it thrives on riling people up without really contributing anything. Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, there's an element of that. So I wouldn't call talk radio toxic as my primary descriptor. There's an element, there's a strong amount of toxicity in varying forms of right-wing talk radio, but it varies by the host. I say it's very low on a Hugh Hewitt scale. But Rush Limbaugh said some wise things, and he said some stupid things. He said some pro-social things. He said some anti-social things. I just think that his overall scorecard as far as civic virtue was quite mixed.
Right. But my take on that was always that if you accept this frame, which is that the media has always been biased, and then Rush Limbaugh is like pre-Fox News. Rush Limbaugh is a pre-Fox News corrective to the liberal media. So you can't really tone police him because his presence in itself was exposing hypocrisy.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you get off the hook or that you don't take into account the overall quality and effect of what he does. Everything you said is true, but you still hold someone to account. You don't get let off the hook because you're part of a victim group. So conservatives disdain this type of reasoning when it comes to minority groups that don't vote for them, such as African Americans. Conservatives will not let, say, African Americans off the hook for the vices that they commit, but they simultaneously want their tribe to be let off the hook for the bad things that they do because they're victims. I don't believe that any individual or any group gets to be let off the hook because they can make a substantial case for victimization. I agree that the mainstream media is biased towards the left, but just because Rush is part of this victimhood group doesn't mean that he doesn't get to be scrutinized for his overall civic contribution.
Sure. And I don't suggest that he is off the hook because of victim status. I think that he was expressing a righteous indignation. That was his tone, I think it's fair to say. And that in some cases, righteous indignation is justified. So you can't always say, well, you sound mean when you're speaking right now, like you sound angry, but there are reasons in this world occasionally to be angry.
Sure, but I think we have to primarily think what was his overall effect, and did he improve the tone of political conversations? Did he help people to understand things from multiple points of view, or was he presenting a product that was keenly developed to advance his own interests at the expense of the United States of America? So I don't think Rush Limbaugh was a terrible person. I don't think that his overall production was terrible for America. I think that the more intelligent critiques of Rush have substance, that there were some things that he did were good and some things were bad. I haven't thought about Rush Limbaugh in a few years, but I think to the extent that he enhanced victimization in his listeners and then let them off the hook for how they reacted to that's probably not good. And there is a time and a place for anger. I displayed anger on several occasions yesterday when I needed the energy to get some things done. So if anger allows you the strength and the energy to get something done in the moment, it serves you. Other than that, anger doesn't improve anyone's life in general. So becoming righteously indignant about things over which you have no control does not serve the listener. You can be 100% morally correct, but enhancing and stimulating and turning up the intensity of righteous indignation over things over which people have no control does not make the listener or the country better. It comes at a price. It's good for you as a performer. It's bad for your audience.
Right. And it is a product, like media, I suppose, is a product. And I think that you have to be cognizant of your own content as being a product, which sounds very cynical, but that's what it is. I guess that's kind of my point, is that you can't really hold it against a media company or like a conservative website that they're trying to sell advertising. And I suppose it becomes a grift when you don't even really believe what you're saying yourself.
Well, there's nothing wrong with selling advertising or memberships. The problem is if what you're selling is bad, is toxic. So, for example, much of right-wing media is funded by various operations encouraging people to buy gold coins, and these operations are almost always a scam. People would almost always be better off financially doing something else. And so if you are getting paid by promoting something that's overwhelmingly bad for people, I think that's bad. If you are getting paid by doing something that is indifferent then, or even positive for some people who do it, overall isn't a terrible thing, then that's a different thing.
Sure. And I think that was just bringing a set of facts to people that was not otherwise being presented. So to that extent, I think it was a good thing.
But I don't think he was primarily bringing facts. He was like Ben Shapiro, he was primarily bringing an emotional experience, which is
right.
not bad, but that was his primary product. It wasn't facts, it wasn't logic, it wasn't philosophy, it wasn't ideology. He primarily brought an emotional experience that was pleasing to many people. It was a lot of fun and not necessarily bad or good, but his primary product was not facts, logic, ideology. It was an emotional experience.
It could be extremely granular details. And that was kind of what set the show apart, is he would really like slice and dice policies in a way that other conservative commentators don't really do. But on the other hand, I'm reading this book, and it's kind of a lowbrow book, to be honest. Someone bought it for me, and I'm grateful for that. It's very high quality, like it has beautiful pictures and everything. And of course, Rush knew a lot of famous and powerful people in politics. But a lot of it is transcripts of him, and it's amazing to me to see how different the tone is of conservative commentary from like the Rush Limbaugh era to now. And it seems, frankly, very ingenuous. His overall message was like, America's the greatest place ever. You can do anything in America. Your dreams are achievable. But unfortunately, the Democrats don't want you to achieve your dreams.
Yeah, which is not an impressive message, but an emotionally powerful one. So what's the name of the book? I want to run out and get a copy right now.
Radio's Greatest of All Time, Rush Limbaugh.
Right, and he was the greatest of all time at what he did in terms of his success, but success does not equal pro-social. So that message that you just outlined, it did not make America a better place.
No. And it's just, extremely simplistic, but it's also almost, I said ingenuous, I mean, maybe naive. At any rate, it's really a very different message than what we hear now from conservative commentators, like America's the greatest place and you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That was conservatism until basically Trump, I think. And since Trump, it was like, wow, America has some real problems. Oh my God. I don't know if you can make it, because there's some structural mistakes that have been made, such as outsourcing, such as free trade, such as wars that have been very stupid, and we need to fix those problems. I mean, that's quite a different pitch.
Yeah, and that's only surprising if one thinks that there's an essence to conservative politics, and there isn't. Politics is primarily an alliance system, and then people find the alliance that they think will get power, and then they create explanations and justifications for an alliance that will get power. The idea that Robert Kennedy is part of the Republican winning coalition would have been mind-blowing to Republican elites just a few years ago, but now that he's part of the coalition, then MAGA and Republicans change their rhetoric and their ideology to try to justify it. Tucker Carlson 15 years ago was filled with contempt for the Tucker Carlson of today. He was filled with contempt for Alex Jones. He's filled with contempt for these cheap conspiracy theories that he now traffics, because the Republican Party used to be a higher IQ, more institution-aligned party 15 years ago. Donald Trump found a path to power through appealing to voters who don't vote very much with a lower IQ message by using more conspiracy theories and Alex Jones type of appeals. And so now the Conservatism Incorporated realizes it has to kind of justify it and creates all sorts of justifications. But politics isn't primarily driven by ideology or philosophy or policy. It is primarily an alliance system.
Well, I think the discourse might be a little bit more lowbrow, but I think the critique itself is more insightful than it was previously. That the Rush Limbaugh era of talk radio during George W. Bush and Barack Obama, it was really like a blind patriotism. And whereas under Trump, it's a little bit more introspective, even though, yeah, like the tone is not super intellectual.
Yeah, so it's less mannered. It's more raw. I do think that Trump more accurately describes problems, and I agree with the Democratic consultant on Mark Halperin's show, Dan Turrentine, who makes the point that Trump won on substance. Right? Trump did not win painting the shining city on the hill of Reagan's rhetoric or the gauzy story of Rush Limbaugh. So I think that Trump and MAGA are more raw and more rooted in reality in many instances than the old Republican message.
Yes. And it's a very, there's like a childlike innocence to that Reagan message that in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, it was that the Democrats were not patriotic and we are. But I think, you've referenced the Iraq War. Really, you know what, 40, let me abruptly cut this call short. Someone's calling me. I just want to make sure this is not. But anyway, thanks for having me on, bro. Appreciate it.
Yep. Take care, bro. Talk to you.
In the way people may have children or not. So not just divorce, but delayed marriage for people getting married or never getting married, cohabiting, delaying having children, et cetera, et cetera. That has huge, just that has huge consequences as a background or context for American religion, because most traditional religion is very much oriented toward the quote unquote traditional nuclear family. Women entering the paid workforce. I mean, this happened in the late 60s and through the 70s. So that transforms. All right, I said I'm not going to explain all the causal mechanisms, but that has a big consequence in terms of who's available to volunteer for whatever committees and so on and so on. Things we've already talked about here, long-term declining participation in face-to-face membership organizations, the triumph of mass consumerism, intensified expressive individualism, the rise of emerging adulthood, which I've talked about in other works, this idea that between being a teen and a fully settled down adult.
So I like what Michael did there. Your life should be more important to your participation in Horty's live stream. Your social media should complement and at least have no negative effect on your life. So there are a lot of things that should be more important to one than participating in social media.
The time of the period of life that represents has stretched out very, very long now, so that people are sort of adults, sort of not really adults for a decade, and that.
So why did the Roman Empire fall? Because the marginal benefit of belonging to the Roman Empire was exceeded by the cost. Why has religious participation declined in America? Because people experience the marginal benefit of participating in organized religion was exceeded by the cost. People found comfort and people found their needs met by doing things outside of religion.
That changes people's experiences and their relationships with institutions and so on. Also because traditional being religious is associated with being an adult for most teenagers. if you're not fully a settled down adult yet, then you're not really ready for religion. Maybe you'll do it sometime in the future, but it's not what you're supposed to be doing now. Then more recently, things like the rise of televangelism and the religious right. This is the Hal Fisher thesis that.
So why does charisma play such an outsized role in American culture, politics, and religion compared to every other developed country? So America prizes the idea of the self-made man. America loves the idea that one person can reinvent themselves, rise from nothing, change the world. America loves to elevate figures who look larger than life, right? It treats them as proof that America still works. America has weak formal hierarchies. We don't have a monarchy. We don't have a formal aristocracy, right? We don't have the formal hierarchies that dominate pretty much every other developed country. Americans love the idea of transformation, not just administration, right? Americans love renewal, rebirth, destiny. Other nations are much more comfortable with having dull managers as leaders. Americans love self-help culture. Americans love the idea of an inner awakening, a catalyst for becoming something different and greater. All right, we have a long tradition of revivalism, charismatic preaching, teaching in tongues. I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist. I grew up in an academic family. I grew up in a Seventh-day Adventist college campus, initially Avondale College in Currumbong, Australia, and then Pacific Union College in the Napa Valley. And then about age 10, for the first time we went to a charismatic church, I was just scared to death. Like, people were being slain by the Lord and speaking in tongues, and it's just completely contrary to my religious experience. That kind of Pentecostal religion, much more popular in the United States than in any other developed country. So America is the soil that is right for charismatic pull. Right? Individualism weakens social ties, social cohesion, social connection. When people are expected to create their own lives, create their own identity without as much guidance from family, tradition, and community, people feel exposed. Freedom leaves people feeling vulnerable when they make suboptimal choices. So they look for someone to provide charisma and direction and clarity to fill the hole in the soul. Loneliness lowers resistance. Americans are probably more lonely than any other developed country. Americans work longer hours, they have higher mobility, they have weak ties to their neighborhood, they have shallow friendships. When people feel lonely, unseen, they respond strongly to anyone who makes them feel seen, recognized, lifted up. Right? Charisma works most powerfully on the people who are most in need, who have the fewest connections, who lack steady social mirrors. Right? This lack of cohesion and community breaks guardrails. Right? Every other developed country has much stronger guardrails. America has very thin guardrails. Americans crave emotional energy and personal fulfillment and transcendent experiences. Americans love a good story. So America produces charismatic politics on a scale no other developed nation does. Like, that's why American politics just seem so weird to other countries.
I agree with there's a huge backlash against that among certain sectors of Americans. The spread of Eastern religions and New Age movements. There's a whole story here about the parents of millennials, the 60s and 70s and the cultural revolutions there, and the intervening 1980s that was a supposed return to tradition and virtue, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there was a lot happening in the 60s and 70s that was the start of this. They got put on pause, basically, in the 80s, and then picked up again in 90s.
So a lot of people stopped participating in organized religion during COVID, during the lockdowns. And then once you lose the habit of something that is not natural or immediately fulfilling for you, many people have just never gone back, all right? There are some habits that are quite tenuous, and then along comes a crisis like COVID, and then people never return to organized religion. There's been a great deal of conversation, particularly on the right, the past 3 weeks about the need to fight anti-Semitism. And as someone who converted to Orthodox Judaism, this notion is virtually absent from the Jewish tradition. Right? There is no mitzvah, no divine commandment to get out there and fight anti-Semitism. Right? The priorities of the Torah way of life are internal. Their study, their performance of divine commandments, they are family, community, keeping the group intact, right? Maintaining boundaries, not engaging in moral crusades in wider society. So when the Orthodox Jew does fight anti-Semitism today, it does not come from the place of Torah or Orthodox Judaism. it comes from a place of pragmatism and secular influence. It can be a job, right? You can make money from it, just like the Orthodox rabbis who earn their living through outreach to non-religious Jews. They are not the top Torah scholars in the tribe, right? They are the least accomplished in Torah, but they just are good with people. So fighting anti-Semitism, hey, it's a job. It's a way to earn money. It can be a path to prestige in secular America. And many Orthodox Jews are affected by their secular surroundings and the civil rights ethos. And so they pick up on these non-Jewish priorities. So the traditional Torah way of life is about connecting to God. It's not about reducing Gentile hostility, right? Gentile hostility is treated as just part of the texture of exile. Your job is to build a strong internal life, not to fix the outside world. Right? Modern activism flips that. It says, the world must change, and Jews should lead the way. That is not a Torah traditional Jewish perspective. And I think it's wise. Right? Stop treating hate as some kind of solvable engineering problem. Recognize that people have incentives to hate. And if you love something, you're going to hate anything that threatens it. Right? Identity is safest when it is lived, not when it is advertised. Right? Allow for more freedom of association. You'll get more social cohesion, social connection. A cohesive group will have a quiet power. Right? Power doesn't necessarily have to be loud and displayed through social activism. Right? Don't confuse safety and the health of the group with applause from outsiders. Right? Moral grandstanding doesn't necessarily serve you, serve what is good, serve America. Right? Develop a thick identity intertwined with people like you. Put a priority on stability over spectacle. Right? Don't let outrage set the agenda. You'll be more resilient. You'll experience less emotional whiplash. Your energy will be better directed. We can learn from the lack of enthusiasm for fighting anti-Semitism among those who have the strongest basis in Torah.
And sort of carried through. So it didn't sort of start whole cloth in the 90s. The parents mattered. But the parents grew up in a different era with different realities around them than their children did. So the children were able to carry things out in a way that their parents were not. Okay. Lots of other things I'm not going to raise here, but what really mattered in the beginning of the 90s, I think, was the end of the Cold War. And America having to come to terms with what it was anymore and who it was and what we didn't have an enemy to unite us that was identified as atheistic, Marxist, Leninist, communists, and we were the believing, at least God-fearing nation. Not everybody believed, but as a national identity, we were God-fearing. That sort of evaporated.
So another topic dominating the news, particularly on the right, is post-liberalism. It's become an increasingly popular topic over the last 10 years since Donald Trump first went down the elevator. Here's what I mean by post-liberalism. Simply a recognition of the fictional nature of the liberal conception of life, that we're all born with these inalienable rights, that we're all born and should be regarded primarily as individuals. No, we're primarily members of extended families. It is a recognition of the fictional nature of the buffered identity, that we can all decide on our own what is right and wrong. We can all be strategic and autonomous, using our own cognitive powers to plot our way through life. It's a recognition of the fictional nature that life is primarily an individualist enterprise, when really a group strategy will almost always defeat an individualist strategy. Right? And it's a recognition that liberalism promotes pluralism and rights, which diminish the power of democracy and allows for elite rule, as opposed to a united, cohesive people. That is more of the image of populism. So the ground under liberalism is shifting because its narrative is increasingly recognized as fictional. They're all buffered, self-creating individuals that can just decide right and wrong on our own. So the buffered self is collapsing. People feel less autonomous than ever. People feel economically vulnerable. People feel shoved and pushed around by algorithms, by institutional capture, by social media identity churn, right? We increasingly experience life as incredibly porous rather than buffered. And liberalism needs the fiction of the bounded, buffered individual to work. And that fiction That myth is fraying. Elite rule is glaring and discomforting. So liberalism promises peaceful marketplace of ideas, but in practice, it facilitated rule by experts. We had this highly credentialed class who would dominate our culture, our media, and our administration. We got oligarchy with a smiley face. Democracy was reduced because courts and elites could subvert it. So the will of the people had less and less sway as elite expert rule had more and more dominance. So people want to see what a united, cohesive people can create. People experience the world as fragmented and chaotic, and liberalism assures us that these disagreements can be managed, but people increasingly experience fragmented, pluralistic, chaotic life in America as life in a pressure cooker. Right? People want peace. People want a thicker communal identity. The thin individualist identity offered by liberalism feels brittle and vulnerable. We have a rise of people seeking politics, meaning in politics. People want to belong. People want to connect. People want purpose, hierarchy, community, social cohesion. Liberalism treats all these things as individualist private matters. Right? We need a shared narrative, shared hero system, shared authority, shared obligations to feel whole. Liberalism tries to tie the hands of the state, and then we get crises like immigration, pandemics, war that make people hungry for a state that can act decisively. And the post-liberal perspectives promise more decisiveness and cohesion. So post-liberalism keeps rising because it speaks directly to the chaos that people don't like. We're told we're sovereign, buffered, bounded individuals, but we experience life as shaped by forces we can't control. People want more honesty and thicker identity. Liberalism came along and earned its status and prestige by solving real problems. Right? There are many benefits to the liberal fictions. There are many benefits to believing in a buffered, bounded individual identity. Right? There are benefits to liberalism. I like freedom of speech, for example. That is one of the gifts of liberalism. So liberalism got some things right. It protected people from intrusive traditions and communities. It reduced the cruelty of power. It allowed different peoples to live together without going to war, created space for creativity. But liberalism is based on a fiction such as buffered identity. We're not primarily individuals. We're not primarily self-created islands. We live lives that are porous, vulnerable, social, tribal, shaped by forces we can't see. Liberalism asks us to pretend otherwise. So the gap between the theory of liberalism and our experience of life is growing greater and greater and greater until we cannot ignore it anymore. The claims of liberal neutrality and rule by experts turned out not to be so neutral. Right? There's always a hero system between every ideology. Liberalism has its own hero system, but it claims neutrality when it's really another moralistic view of how life should be. People don't like how fragmented and chaotic their experience of life is. Right? Liberalism can manage diversity when the underlying culture is cohesive, but the underlying culture in America is no longer cohesive. So pluralism becomes centrifugal. People feel the world is more and more chaotic. It's not that we disagree with our neighbors, it's just that it's that we inhabit rival moral universes. Procedure-heavy, elite, expert rule restricts the role of democracy. People don't feel like they can elect people who can make a difference. So people need liberalism plus nationalism, liberalism plus tradition, liberalism plus religion, liberalism plus community.
That went away quite quickly with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And we're still grappling now with what is America? Like, what does anything hold us together? Mm-hmm. Ascendant neoliberal capitalism in the 1990s and thereafter, and globalization, I think transformed both the conditions of work.
So yes, I've read Dostoevsky, read all his classics, and not a huge fan, right? There was a time and a place in my life in my 20s where I embraced Dostoevsky, but I don't feel much of a yearning to return to Dostoevsky. I much prefer Tolstoy.
Of younger people, what it took to be successful in the world. that made them less rooted, less what a traditional religion would expect of people, more mobile, more transient, and also changed the notion of what a good life is like, what a good human being is like. And I think neoliberalism did that. The digital revolution is probably the most important factor in all this, and in the book I spell out 9 or 10 distinct causal mechanisms by which the rise of the internet and everything else that's gone along with it sort of transformed people's use of time, people's attention, liquidating gatekeepers, changing underlying epistemologies of who do you trust? Like the internet, there are no gatekeepers in the internet like there used to be in a previous world with Walter Cronkite, et cetera. Pop postmodernism, I don't want to put too much on this, but I actually think it matters a lot. These French theories from the 60s float over the Atlantic. They land in the American humanities departments. They get taught to a whole generation and more of college students who don't really get the sophisticated parts of it, but they walk away believing, oh, okay, well, you can't trust authorities anymore, and we don't even know what authors really intended, and beyond every knowledge claim, there's a suspicion of a power grab, et cetera. I think really had an influence on the culture. Even other very simple millennial demographic mobility to cities. So millennials moved a lot, even more than boomers, and I run an analysis of where they moved from, where they moved to. Most of the places they moved to had less supply of religious organizations. And
right, when people move west in the United States, they become less religious because religion has less power. Formal hierarchies such as schools and communities, ethnic groups have much less power on the West Coast compared to the East. One of the least toxic right-wing talk shows is That by Hugh Hewitt.
Continuity. Matt, who matters in 150 years from now? Who will be the subject of whatever is Netflix on whatever platform exists in 150 years?
Well, I think it's heads of state. So obviously President Trump will be remembered 150 years from now. Vladimir Putin 150 years from now. Xi Jinping, and probably Erdogan of Turkey. I think those are probably the figures who are going to have the longest lasting impression in the histories.
Erdogan is interesting. That's on my list for the next subject here, because Saudi Arabia has been in town this week and traffic's been a nightmare with the Crown Prince being here. Who's more important to our future, Erdogan or the Crown Prince?
Well, I think they're connected, Hugh. I think they're both connected. Erdogan's Turkey is a growing power. He is increasing his influence in the Middle East. That's part of the Syria play. He's also increasing his opposition to Israel. And so I think becoming a node in the next version of the anti-Israel network in the Middle East. And so that's why we need allies like Saudi Arabia. We need Saudi Arabia to balance out forces like Iran, but also potentially forces like Turkey. And so I think we do need MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, on America's side. You know, we've had a long relationship with the Saudis in the United States. It's never been pretty, never. But it's of necessity, and I think the necessity continues. In some cases, that's because of oil. Not so much anymore, because President Trump has made us energy independent, though our allies still need oil from the Middle East. But I think right now it's about investment, and especially investment in these data centers and factories that are going to make the chips and increase our technological edge and self-sufficiency over China.
Matt, I want to play for you in the audience a 90-second video of 6 Democrats. Their message has become quite controversial, elicited a strong response from President Trump. Here is that video.
I'm Senator Alyssa Slotkin.
Senator Mark Kelly. Representative Chris Deluzio.
Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander.
Representative Chrissy Houlihan.
Congressman Jason Crow. I was a captain in the United States Navy.
Former CIA officer.
Former Navy. Former paratrooper and Army Ranger.
Former intelligence officer.
Former Air Force.
We want to speak directly to members of the military
and the intelligence community
who take risks each day to keep Americans safe.
We know you are under enormous stress and pressure right now.
Americans trust their military.
But that trust is at risk. This administration is pitting our uniformed military
and intelligence community professionals
against American citizens. Like us, You all swore an oath
to protect and defend this Constitution.
Right now, the threats to our Constitution aren't just coming from abroad, but from right here at home.
Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders.
You can refuse illegal orders.
You must refuse illegal orders.
No one has to carry out orders that violate the law or our Constitution.
We know this is hard.
And that it's a difficult time to be a public servant.
But whether you're serving in the CIA,
the Army, or Navy,
the Air Force,
your vigilance is critical.
And know that we have your back.
Because now, more than ever,
the American people need you.
We need you to stand up for our laws,
our Constitution,
and who we are as Americans. Don't give up.
Don't give up. Don't give up.
Don't give up the ship.
Matt Conetti, Don't Give Up the Ship is famously associated with the Battle of Lake Erie, in which the Buckeyes took an entire British squadron in the War of 1812. But what this is about, it's an outrageous video, and it fried me, because it says the threats are right here at home to our Constitution. Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders. What do you think they were trying to say?
I think what they were trying to say was that Donald Trump is either already ordering the military and intelligence community to do illegal things, or is about to order the military and the intelligence community to do illegal things. I think it's an example of gaslighting. None of the legislators involved have been able to point to a single unlawful order this president has given. This president has obeyed court orders when he's told that he needs to stop a process, or most of the time he's allowed to do it as those processes work up to the Supreme Court. And so I think it lacks evidence. I think it uses the same rhetoric, this enemy within rhetoric, that the Democrats condemn whenever Donald Trump uses it. And I also think it puts the troops in a very awkward position. If the legislators are so concerned, what are they doing? Why is it why is the onus on the individual soldier or case officer? It should be Congress that should be raising the alarm and trying to stop the president. So I think it's both kind of imposing on our troops and condescending to them at the same time. I think it's a very inflammatory and disturbing exercise.
Wildly irresponsible. There are 1.3 million people in uniform. There's going to be a least bright member of the 1.3 million. There's going to be a Gomer pile. And you show that to the wrong person, and they are going to feel empowered. And when they say, we've got your back, no, they don't. They don't have anybody's back. They're legislators.
Here's what kind of got my attention. I have nothing but respect for our troops, for our uniformed soldiers, and for our intelligence officers. But I'd also know that the intelligence community, when it comes to Donald Trump, has not behaved responsibly over the past decade.
Correct.
And so when I hear Alessis Slotkin say, I have your back, I kind of hear, hey, next Vindman, next whistleblower who wants to do something to screw up Trump in his last 2 years in office, we're right there waiting for you. Not to the troops necessarily, but to the people who are opposed to this president working in the FBI and the CIA. That's kind of what got my attention. And again, eliding that distinction between them and the uniformed soldiers who are trained to disobey unlawful orders. This is not anything our soldiers don't already know, which makes the whole exercise even more egregious to me.
The most interesting story is whose idea was it, and how did they persuade otherwise apparently smart people to join in? Because while Donald Trump exploded on Truth Social and they're trying to make themselves victim now, the reality is it was profoundly irresponsible.
Anyway, so there's just an ecological argument about where people end up and what they're able to connect with. And not to mention the fact that when you move, that's usually disruptive in terms of social networks and so on and so on.
So Mark Halperin over the past week repeatedly said he didn't want to address the story, thought it was a non-story, because all these Democratic politicians did was to tell people in the military and the intelligence services, do not follow illegal orders. So Mark is taking the message at its denotative level, just what it literally said. But we don't operate just on denotative levels, all right? We also operate on connotative levels. And the connotation of what they were doing was to encourage leaking and probably often illegal behavior or anything that will throw a spanner in the works of Donald Trump. So yes, on the denotative, literal level of what they said, you cannot object. But communication does not just take place on the literal level, right? There's also other levels, the connotative level, the mystical level, the cultural level, how it will be received by different people in different situations. So I think it was a much more significant story and a much more outrageous thing to do by these Democratic politicians than Hal Brands.
Ukraine and a variety of European countries rallying behind Kyiv.
I think this is a very, very meaningful, I would say probably best meeting and day we've had so far. There's still some work left to do, and that's what our teams are going to be doing right now.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke about the negotiations and a 28-point peace plan that has circulated in recent days.
I have signed it.
So Zelensky is at his weakest due to a series of corruption scandals. So Trump has a sense of when people are weak and when he can bully them to do the things that he wants them to do.
Things like the rise of intensive parenting, what it meant to be a good parent during this era, placed much more burden on parents to constantly be scheduling things and developing all your kids' musical talents and sports talents, and et cetera, et cetera. In a way, I think detracted from religion.
I never foresaw or expected this kind of intensive parenting, and where parents felt some kind of moral obligation to show up to their kids' softball game. It just blows my mind.
September 11 was a whole another huge matter that affected things. I think effectively it took the concept of religion, even though it was the bad Muslims who did it. I think eventually, culturally speaking, religion itself got tarnished, essentially polluted as related to violence and disorder and murder and so on. And that's related to the argument of the new atheists that came after September 11, where they sort of nailed these arguments down. They didn't really make much sense, in my opinion, or they were really problematic, but a lot of people were influenced by, wow, religion is that fundamental source of all the evil in the world. So the new atheism mattered. I argue that something like a third sexual revolution happened in this era, related to pornography, related to the digital revolution.
People often choose the type of sex life they want, right? You want a varied, promiscuous sex life, you're very unlikely to want to participate in a religion. Or people choose they want to get married, be monogamous, and raise children, right? Then you're much more likely to choose to participate in organized religion. So often people choose the sex life they want, and then their religion or lack of religion choice just follows from that.
In which young people's sense of what is normal sexually transformed in a way that they understood to be radically incompatible with what traditional religion taught. The mainstreaming of LGBT.
So modern Orthodox Judaism has been pretty friendly to the trans and the gay movements comparatively, while traditional Judaism not so friendly.
Q had a similar effect. Religious pluralism, there were lots of books. One at a Harvard Divinity School was especially important, arguing we're the most religiously pluralistic nation in the world. So this related to the question of what holds us together anymore. And there are behind all this, there's evidence to show, like survey evidence of what Americans talk about, answering questions like what's necessary to be a good American, and the religion part just slips down and down and down. Rise of identity politics, so people's sense of what are the core categories that define who I am. I think like being a Methodist, as we've already said, like that just sort of slipped way down the list, and other things became much more important.
Right, you can have a strong, vibrant masturbation life, but you can't enjoy a strong, vibrant masturbation life and have a strong prayer life and God-centered life as well. Right, masturbation, porn use will tend to cut away at any religious allegiance.
And as part of that, the sacralization of partisan politics, like in some ways, politics itself took on certain characteristics of sacredness and like ultimacy that I think sort of sidelined religion. I make an argument that the war on terror, political polarization, global warming, and so on for millennials had this effect of creating like a blanket of despair about the future that seemed to them incompatible with what traditional religion was all about. Changes in the economy, basically, I mean, objectively, including the dot-com bubble burst and the 2008 meltdown for millennials, including my own kids, like their economic futures were compromised by globalization, neoliberalism, these other things. The idea that if I just work hard, get an education, I will be able to have this American dream. That really kind of fell apart, and what I argue is the traditional American dream is connected to traditional religion, and so there was sort of a general disengagement from investment. It's part of a general disengagement. We're talking about volunteering, et cetera, et cetera. Millennials had less and less of a stake in the future. And as part of that was the religious, not feeling like they had a stake in a religious tradition. This whole movement around being good without God, all of this I document empirically. And then finally, on top of all that from the outside, within religion, all sorts of missteps and kind of shooting themselves in the head essentially happened. The sort of religion piled on all those things.
And into the gap comes these offers of charismatic connection.
A kind of dangerous connotation of story. But humans are storytelling creatures. This is simply how we organize information about the world. The difference between a charismatic leader who is an agent of moral progress and one who is not has everything to do with whether the leader offers a story grounded in reality, maybe inviting followers into a new way of organizing what they already know about the world and reinterpreting their own relationship to it. And on the other hand, there are leaders who are fabulists, who pull back the veil on a pseudo-reality. But my point is that charisma in and of itself is morally neutral. I think this way of approaching charismatic leadership as...
So charisma may be morally neutral, but it's just incredibly dangerous. I've seen far more people's lives being destroyed by charismatic clergy than by non-charismatic clergy.
Transcendent storytelling.
The more charismatic the clergy, the more likely I have seen for them to get into scandalous behavior.
Helps a little bit with a problem that scholars and journalists who study religion have been dealing with for a few decades now. And that is an over-reliance on poll data to traditional religious institutions. When professional expertise, respect for professional expertise, the charisma of experts, the power of the story that experts were telling about the world, you could say, when it peaked and then began to fall apart. In our own time, then, we have seen the rise of a different type of charismatic leader, and that's a type I call the guru. Now, what's a guru? Number one, a guru tells you to put your trust in him or her as an individual. They may link themselves to an institution or tradition or scripture, but they position themselves as the best interpreter. Second, a guru presents a totalizing worldview. If you accept the assumptions that...
So I was raised a Protestant, and Protestants are much more vulnerable to the claims of a guru because the ethos of Protestantism is that any person can come to the Bible and experience God. I ended up converting to Judaism, which has the more traditional perspective that your understanding of sacred text should be shaped by the tradition. And a tradition is much wiser than one's individual conscience. So I would much prefer people to be guided by the wisdom of a tradition than by what comes to them spontaneously when they encounter a text.
That he or she presents, then you have an answer to every big question about right and wrong, the ultimate goals in life. Number three, that worldview is based on an alternative picture of reality, a new set of facts that are at odds with what outsiders see. And number 4, gurus operate adjacent to electoral politics rather than right in it, although sometimes they do make the leap. Before I say more about the guru, I want to talk a little bit about the age of the expert. From 1945 into the 1960s was the heyday of cultural authority for secular scientific expertise in North America. Think about higher education booming after World War II, loads of federal investment in research. A bit later, the technocrats working for John F. Kennedy on economic policy, on Vietnam, pitching the story of the new frontier to Americans, a narrative that essentially said, trust expert-led innovation, expert-led foreign policy, America will spread democracy, spread a higher standard of living, we will get to the moon. I'll add that the 1950s and the early 1960s were also the last time when you could say that traditional religious institutions and religious experts, so to speak, were in charge. This was the last era when liberal Protestant churches were thriving, at least by the numbers. Just to give you one data point, the United Methodist Church had about 11 million members in the mid-60s. Now they're down to about 6 million, which in the context of population growth is really striking, and losing about 200,000 members annually. Another trend I want to flag, it's a bit different, that begins in the post-war era, is the beginning of the charismatic renewal movement, which was an explosion of that older kind of charisma, the New Testament Holy Spirit kind of charisma, in churches that had never known this kind of thing before, at least in this miraculous, sensory way, hands up in the air, speaking in tongues, people getting slain in the Spirit. These revivals spread around the world. You could argue they are still spreading. And in some ways, charismatic renewal did breathe new vitality into established institutions. I mean, one of the key early nodes of this revival was among middle-class Episcopalians in the LA area. The Catholic Church, after a brief kind of hesitation, really embraced charismatic renewal. At the same time, though, I think you could argue that charismatic renewal chipped away at the authority of more traditional Christian institutions, as revivals often do, and emboldened over the long term independent, non-denominational megachurch pastors, religious entrepreneurs, rather than older groups and denominations. You probably also associate the 50s and 60s with the rise of the counterculture, certainly a movement driven by skepticism of institutions. My point is that by the 1960s, we have a complicated picture. The experts, the educated establishment church leaders still seem fairly comfortable in their cultural authority, but this is starting to erode if you kind of know what to look for. Now let me give you a snapshot from the end of this period when this erosion starts to give way to kind of full-on collapse. This was a moment in my research where I really saw the value of putting the narrative of mainstream political history alongside the history of the supernatural religious movements that scholars tend to keep sort of cordoned off. So let's zoom in to one place in time, 1970, Southern California, specifically UCLA. Picture Angela Davis striding across campus. She's 26 years old. She's a proud member of the Communist Party. She's just coming off a stint in Germany doing doctoral work in Marxist philosophy. And she's come back to the States to get involved with the Black Panthers. UCLA hired her to teach a few classes on the side while she's finishing her dissertation. She likes to teach in a miniskirt. her natural hairstyle framing her face in a perfect sphere, and she just packs in the students. I mean, they adore her. After she dismisses class, they crowd around the podium, working up the nerve to ask questions. And they're not the only ones who hang around. Protesters hang around too. You can find middle-aged Czech refugees, members of the local chapter of Young Americans for Freedom. At this moment, Ronald Reagan is governor, so he's on the UC Board of Regents ex officio, and they are trying to get Davis fired. There are
So wanted to develop on the Rush Limbaugh talk radio theme, and political scientist James Joyner was traditionally right of center, but during the age of Trump, he's moved left of center. And I think he's got a sharp and accurate critique here. He said, Rush Limbaugh's shtick transformed the conservative movement in destructive ways because it showed how lucrative playing to the prejudices of an aggrieved base can be. Right? Rush promoted a business model that depended on keeping people riled up and feeding their belief system to encourage them to become mean and dishonest. So discussion of nuance and differences of emphasis, which is where politics in a democracy should gravitate, weren't enough to get millions to tune in for 3 hours every day. No, the opposition must be monsters out to destroy all that the good people hold dear. And Milwaukee Magazine, August 24, 2009, published an essay by a news director at a right-wing talk radio station in Milwaukee. And this is the sharpest analysis I've seen on the business of talk radio. To succeed, a talk radio host must perpetuate the notion that his listeners are victims, and the host is the vehicle by which they can become empowered. So the host frames every issue in us versus them terms. There has to be a bad guy against whom the host will emphatically defend these loyal listeners. The enemy can be a politician or a rhino, a Republican in name only, someone who's not conservative enough, can be the cold, cruel government bureaucracy. And conservative talk show hosts have often received their daily talking points in email form from the Bush White House or the Republican National Committee, and then they just repurpose them. And this framing from 2009 still holds, right? You still get a dominant victimhood mentality, a tribal framing, us versus them. Conservatives are the victims of the liberal elite, of the liberal news media. This narrative fuels loyalty, it fuels engagement, and it's supercharged by social media echo chambers. You make selective use of facts, you have narrative control, you can cherry pick those narratives, those facts that support your argument, you can sideline any dissenting voice, and then you can create viral clips, memes, and cross-platform messaging. You will want to entertain first, and outrage drives engagement, right? Nuance and balance don't perform well in a fragmented, attention-driven media economy.
Death threats. She has to get a bodyguard. At one point, some vigilantes of disillusioned hippies and middle-class kids fleeing their parents' churches. And it's a movement that in many ways grew out of established institutions, but it loathes institutions. Let me read you Hal Lindsey talking to a reporter. He says, "These kids hate impersonalness, bigness, irrelevance, materialism. And I've just given you a description of the average institutional church." Now, I'm not saying that the Jesus freaks and the student activists rallying for Angela Davis are one unified movement. But I am saying that the Jesus freaks seeking the Holy Spirit and the charismatic relationship that Davis has with her followers are on a continuum. They are related responses to the same cultural situation. They reflect a shared sense of being fed up with the cosmos. They're full of young people who've been shaped by institutions that have let them down. And they're hungry for a new eschatology, an account of how all this injustice is going to end. There's a way in which it's these young people shaped by working inside institutions but feeling betrayed by them who help tear down the authority of universities and the authority of the quote-unquote mainstream churches. Given this, it makes sense, I think, that the late 60s and the 70s were an age of new religious movements, ranging from the infamous and scary ones like Jim Jones' People's Temple, to those movements that were sometimes benign, sometimes a bit cult-like the evangelical charismatic Children of Love, the Guru Maharaji's Divine Light Mission. Now, these movements varied tremendously in theology and practice, but they all orbited around a guru, a charismatic leader who could look at you and make you feel seen, like all of your problems are suddenly out in the open and acknowledged as real and serious, and they mean something. They are part of a bigger picture, which you can understand if you're willing to come along and understand this new way of seeing the world. I'll just flag, too, the cliches of this era, which should be floating in our brains, right? This is the era of deep disillusionment over the Vietnam War, Watergate. By the time we're in the 1970s, the decline of mainline church attendance is undeniable. Now, scholars like to zoom out and call the big picture here secularization, which is a term we tend to use mainly in the context of religion. But to me, secularization is not about the decline of the religious impulse. It's eroding trust in institutions in general, which is a category that includes churches, and the transfer of that religious impulse somewhere else. By the time we get to the 1980s, the guru is not a leadership model that we see only on the margins. This model of authority takes off in the self-help industry, in leadership studies programs in business schools, where the trendy message is that your boss is not some lofty person above you in the hierarchy, but comes alongside you as your coach and is going to help you become your most authentic self. Find a kind of spiritual fulfillment by aligning your personal mission with the mission of your employer. There's also that interesting mix of self-help and televangelism that you see in Oprah Winfrey, who is just becoming a national figure at this time. Her show gets syndicated in 1986. And I'd argue you see hints of it in a brash New York businessman who goes on Oprah's show a couple of times and speculates about running for president, Donald Trump.
Interesting article here in the Washington Post, all right? So Hawking Home Edition, dividing neighbors and stumping officials. So when you look at this home, right, what type of person would erect such a structure? Someone who puts their family and their own interests ahead of the community. And this is not someone who was born and raised in America, right? This is constructed by an immigrant. And so when people have such an intense in-group identity that they will erect a structure like that, right? There are good things, right, that come from that. They can take better care of their family and their own in-group, but it comes at the price of the health and cohesion and trust of the community. So a normal person born, raised in America would not do something like this, right? This is an immigrant who's putting his family first, which sounds quite laudable, but it's not laudable when it comes at the cost of neighborhood beauty, peace, and